Hey everyone, Temporal here, and we have a death of a game to react to. These, I've seen these ones before, not so well. We've actually seen Overwatch ones before, though not from Nerdslayer, though Nerdslayer does have a pretty popular death of a game series. So let's check out what's said here, if it's greatly exaggerated this time, as it has been since the beginning. I mean, Overwatch has been called a dead game ever since it fell behind League of Legends in year one there. There actually was a time when it was battling for the very top, and then, it fell out of favor pretty quickly after that. It obviously had things that pushed it back a bit, like Overwatch League, but let's see what we have to say here.
Who thought we would be returning so soon with the stench of death still in the air, so fresh
So I assume you covered Warcraft 3 Reforged recently.
from our beloved childhood RTS.
I mean, Warcraft 3 was a disaster, the Reforged edition, so I get that.
Blizzard is no more. At least they aren't the same Blizzard. And we don't need to spend an entire video attempting to convince ourselves that they are.
Good. The more people that realize that, the better.
Activision Blizzard is in full effect. And I have something
It's not all Activision's fault. They're just not Blizzard anymore.
to admit, detectives. I didn't fully acknowledge it in the Warcraft 3 Death of a Game video, which if you haven't already seen it, please go do that at some point. It's relevant for this video and the story.
And ours will be an even longer one, Semitic.
The fact is, I didn't look at Blizzard in 2018 or 2020 as fully evolved Activision Blizzard yet.
Okay, it's not all the Activision thing. Like, I get it. We all want to be like, it's the Activision takeover that made them bad. And, like, the Activision takeover certainly didn't help, and it certainly changed them. But companies do change over time regardless. The people that made Diablo 2, Warcraft 3, those types of things were never still going to be around. Like, that's not how the world works. Or if they were around, they weren't going to be as hungry. They were going to be at different stages in their life that was going to cause them to want to focus on different types of stories, that sort of thing. But okay.
As my video kind of exhibits. And that's wrong. Because after taking on the behemoth of a case Overwatch, you can already see the signs back
Let's see what
then.
we've got.
Oh, speaking of which, Overwatch. The king of the hero shooters. The same game that killed many of the titles we have covered on the series already.
Okay.
That's what's on the menu on today's episode of Death of a Game, the post-mortem series where we document the evidence and clues concerning the largest contributing factors to the death of a game or company. With the sequel announced, and then delayed, and Overwatch 1 now existing in some sort of weird limbo where content updates are coming fairly infrequently for a once titan of a multi-
And then when we get a content update, it gives us the patch that nobody wants. Or we get a joke patch before that, is maybe good for being interesting for like 2 to 3 days. But hey.
multiplayer title, I think it's safe
And
to say
one
that
tournament.
Overwatch 1.0's time in the sun has come to an end, with Overwatch 2 set to near forcibly take it over once implemented.
Yeah, this is a little bit of like opportunistic to go, yes, this is the time to hit death of a game. Now Overwatch is dead. Like, Overwatch still does okay in terms of player base, viewership, all that stuff. It's not amazing, don't get me wrong. It's definitely nowhere near its peak. We sort of get to want to get this in here if you're covering deaths of a game before Overwatch 2 comes out, though. So we can understand that.
What went wrong with what seemed to be the shooter title that did no wrong? A mega blockbuster that helped shift the industry. How did the title ensure
They're not going to do it. We're not going to get a new hero in Overwatch 1.
shorter time than some of its competitors failed to last at the top of the mountain despite initial overwhelming success? Choose your role in hero and prepare to drive the payload to what might be the most precipitous fall from grace for a popular shooter we've covered thus far.
Yeah. It did hit really high popularity heights for how low it is now. That's a fair take. The biggest fall for a shooter. I hear you, Lex. He was always going to cover this at some point. You want to do dive support, except they actually go with the dive rather than sitting in the backline with Ana? It's called Moira. It's called Lucio Moira, and it's called Six-Man the comp. But I get it. You want another Lucio-style support.
While Blizzard's tale begins in the early 1990s and encompasses numerous titans such as StarCraft, Warcraft, and of course World of Warcraft.
I mean, there were games before those. Those were some of the big hits. We really want to go back to some of the early Diablo stuff, even some of the Viking stuff, but okay.
We're going to rewind to 2007 and just take a little pit stop.
Sure.
Following World of Warcraft's massive success
Yeah, their peak time was like the StarCraft, Warcraft 3, World of Warcraft era.
in 2004 and the subsequent years, Blizzard, who was still very much Blizzard that we knew at the time, was interested in recreating the magic and producing yet another successful MMORPG. Jeff Kaplan, who worked on WoW prominently as both a game director and head of PvE, where he got the job being a prominent player and community member of EverQuest 1, would lead the team, and the project would be dubbed Titan. If you want to read more details about what the game was originally set to be, check out this piece from Jason Schreier that details more. But for the sake of keeping the video shorter, I'm gonna condense it. Project Titan was in development for 6 years from 2007 to 2013, and it would never see the light of day.
Yeah, usually if your game stays in development for that long, it's a bad sign. The technology evolves too far, too much of what you were working on, like, then doesn't work, and by the time you release it, you spent a massive budget because you've been working on it for too long, or for so long, but then, like, your tech is old. You actually do have windows that you need to hit for game development.
As by May 2013, it was cancelled. There's not much details otherwise released about what the project was, but we know it was set to be an MMO project with an interesting duality of regular social day life and a PvP combat/focused night portion. Players could do things like run shops, businesses, and even start families, just to
Yeah, but that was just standard for MMOs at the time, where it's like, hey, you want to have, I mean, even Final Fantasy XIV, not a Realm Reborn, the first version that they had to drop a meteor on, it was so bad, and it was that bad. I played it. Like, it was standard. MMOs in those days, that's just what you did. You went, hey, you have to have craftsman type stuff. You have to have housing type stuff. Like, that was the direction that everyone was. Maybe you have guild v guild battles, that sort of thing. SWTOR was like, yes, let's have, like, capital ships for our guilds, things like that. Didn't quite get there. But hey, that's what everyone thought at the time.
Illustrate how serious of an MMO style approach of a game they were going for, here are some of the buzzwords used to describe what the game was supposed to be. Team Fortress 2 meets Destiny meets The Sims meets World of Warcraft.
Okay, so they mean Titan, not Overwatch yet. Sure.
But perhaps the full story of Titan is a story for another time.
I was going to say,
when
of
it wouldn't
those,
be
for
fully realized,
actual Overwatch, we got pretty heavily into Team Fortress 2.
Shifted to a new project altogether. The topic of this video. November 7th, 2014 is when Blizzard announced their first new IP in 17 years.
Yeah, it had been a while since we'd seen a new IP. We'd all sort of been like, is Blizzard just going to be Diablo plus StarCraft plus Warcraft? Like, is that what they've got? Is that what they're doing? But they gave us Overwatch, which was good. Like, that was actually good news to see, oh, they can try a new IP, and they kind of landed it. They did land it.
Overwatch, a team-based 6 vs 6 multiplayer shooter with a focus on fun, over-the-top characters. In Overwatch, you played on a map where you attempted to push a payload as a team, or you tried to keep said payload from being pushed. And then you had an attack and defend phase for certain parts of the map, or certain maps entirely. While kills had an impact on the result of a match, the ultimate objective was the objective.
Yep.
Showcasing the announcement was a CG trailer showing off Pixar-like animation.
Yeah,
very pretty art
and
style.
that was very good
the
for
announcement,
them.
Limited gameplay was also shown, where one team must defend a point and the other will attack.
What they did
utilizing
with
a range
their
of different characters and abilities
cinematics
to do
was
such,
huge
such
for
as
the
turrets,
marketing of this
shields, and healing streams. There were 12 playable heroes available, and the title was playable at BlizzCon 2014, with a closed beta to come sometime in 2015. Blizzard would reveal more details concerning Overwatch March 6th, 2015, such as 2 new heroes in McCree or Redacted, Cole Cassidy,
okay, sure,
the gunslinging cowboy with a pistol, or Zarya, the energy laser gravity gun giant Russian lady with cool pink hair.
That's a lot of adjectives for Zarya.
Characters like Zarya, as explained by Blizzard, were developed in a response to a supposed desire for more diversity in games. That's what made
We said that, and then we're like, we're gonna announce the first gay character, it's Tracer. Okay, anyway, continuing. Okay.
Overwatch's character cast so good though. It was diverse, but not in some way that felt overly forced or kind of gimmick.
No, it was, and it was allowed to be diverse because they were pretty willing to make it not strictly FPS. They're willing to include a hero like Roadhog, who is clearly, I mean, he's a Dota hero. Let's not kid ourselves. They were willing to include that with this chain. They were willing to include heroes with barriers. It wasn't just your traditional shooter, and then they also went with an animation style that A, ages well, but B, can be pretty inclusive, that sort of thing. And then we're doing weapon-based combat, which is good for gender representation as well when it comes to combat. So here we go.
Each hero was as unique as the stereotype or aesthetic that they were trying to accomplish.
Sure.
There was a bit of flavor for
It
everyone.
makes it harder to add heroes later, though, when you realize, oh, wait, how do we make them still stay unique? And we ran into some of that problem as they continued to try to add heroes where, well, Echo exists. Echo's a flyer. Isn't Pharah already a flyer? Oh, we've added Ashe. Well, where does Ashe fit when we already have Soldier, Cassidy, and Widow, that sort of thing? But okay.
Around the globe. But most importantly, unlike many other copycats later on, Blizzard's simplicity of the package of each hero was the most impressive part. Anytime you see Zarya, you know it's Zarya. Big gravity gun, shields all over, you get the idea. The hero identity in Overwatch was just very quality.
It was a different
Most
looking Zarya
importantly,
bubble.
was announced the closed beta to come in the fall. Although expectations were initially that the game was supposed to be a casual shooter, and as expectations as in just a few months prior, but now expectations were already starting to shift towards would Overwatch be a competitive shooter? Jeff
Well, I mean, you guys included a closed beta and you invited a lot of people that were former pros in other games. So that was always going to be a, oh, can it be competitive? And then you didn't make it very chance-based in terms of there's not a ton of randomness to it. The elevators were a bad early sign of randomness. Some of the spread on weapons was a bad early sign of randomness. But in general, randomness was pretty low. And if you keep randomness low, if you keep control inputs polished where they consistently do the same type of thing that attracts speedrunners, is also going to attract competitive game players if you have any sort of mode for it, which eventually it did.
Kaplan, the lead developer on Overwatch, would wisely caution against an aspiration for esports, citing Hearthstone as an example, and that you need to give the community a chance to grow competitively, grassroots style, which I fully, wholeheartedly believe in.
Okay. I mean, I know that's always going to be popular to say, and that's why Nerd Slayer went in there and said it, and it was it's a thing that people like to go, oh yes, this is the way to do it, grow the grassroots. Don't get me wrong, it's safer to grow it from the grassroots, but the thing that you have to accept in the modern era of gaming is you can definitely grow something grassroots and be like, hey, this works great, but we got to heights that we probably never would have gotten with Overwatch if we hadn't done the investment that we did from traditional teams, things like that. Yes, we then crashed hard, but there were things that went into that didn't have to lead to that in terms of well, you know what? I'm not going to go into them because I expect them to be covered in this video.
If only they would have heeded that advice.
That's just too popular of a dunk that doesn't have quite enough
Blizzard
back
would
to
take
it.
a
And I
different
know I'll
approach
catch
with
heat
their
for
closed
that.
beta, one that would anger many fans of the company and those interested in the game. They would only allow a very limited amount of testers in, choosing to go for a more true beta-style approach. I was one of the lucky few who got invited into the beta.
Okay.
And boy, was it a different sight. For starters, they actually had a scoreboard.
Yeah, can we have that back, please?
Was very much intent on becoming a pro player in Overwatch. That was my aspiration on this channel before making content about Star Wars and, well, the Death of a Game series. I even won one of the first unofficial LANs, DreamHack Austin, where we beat a top collegiate team and won the open brackets.
Okay, but a top collegiate team back then is a completely different world. Collegiate teams, I mean, that's, I get it. He didn't end up going the pro route. He ended up going the content creation route, all that. But it's just, collegiate has leveled up quite a bit over time.
Story time. The whole thing is kind of crazy. Now, to be fair, I basically just got carried because the last second, a pro player from Team Liquid, V, asked me to play on the team because they needed a sixth. And then at the last second just told me to play tank because the other 4 teammates, who were shooter monster players from other titles that had championships, had never played Overwatch before.
Why not?
So I was stuck on tank duty. But still, for a time, I technically was the highest earning pro because in that same tournament.
There you go. Highest earning pro. He made his pro aspirations, guys. I'm good with it.
And on tank, I won a Razor Blade for scoring the play of the game in the finals. And no, if you're wondering, the play of the game wasn't even impressive. That's the best part. I just yeeted somebody off the map as Reinhardt and basically killed myself in the process. But I was a
that was fine.
Razor Blade richer after that. That's my
that was fine. You shattered 4 people. You took one of them off the map. It's not a great play, but it was fine.
With Overwatch.
You would have been better off just swinging at them after that, but hey.
Started in closed beta. We, being the competitive crowd full of ex-pros and current pros from other games, and then the MMO gamer nerd like me, would make lobbies all the time and just play together. It was a blast. It's what made me so hyped for the game's potential. We even had a series of tournaments organized by Grassroots Gamers where we got to see shoutcasted matches of Overwatch during the closed and open beta.
Okay.
So how did this end up angering fans, besides it was just limited testing? Well, all of this is how hype is being built. And
Right.
Blizzard's first IP in almost 2 decades being showcased as an esport, yet not playable by most people, well, you can kind of imagine why people were so angry or interested in playing.
Kind of
That's
the
because
standard
anytime
now, but
something's
yeah.
competitive or seen as competitive, people want to be, well, competitive. Which means they want to have their chance to play the game, testing or not.
But this is sort of exactly what we're running into with Overwatch 2, where people are concerned that, like, hey, people are just getting to get ahead if they get to play an owl on an Overwatch 2 thing. How will other pros or potential pros ever catch up if the ones that are already there just get this big lead? Now, it might not happen that way. It may happen that a lot of us, or more than we expect, will get access to the beta based on some things that we've seen. But this has been going on since Overwatch 1, as we can see.
Not and have it fair. Blizzard restricting access was fairly common for a beta, but wasn't typical for the mainstream audience at this point, with betas shifting
Sure.
to more marketing ploys at that point
Yeah.
than an actual state of the game.
I mean, it
Overwatch
still
in
was
closed beta,
kind of a
though, was a
marketing
special
ploy because they
experience,
let
so I
them
can't-
do in the beta a lot of content sharing, like people who came from StarCraft, people who came from other shooters. They let them do a fair amount of content creation, and if you were doing true closed betas and you weren't trying to make it a marketing ploy, you'd make part of the deal for access being no sharing content. That's just what you do. And even so, it's still worth doing it because you have a heads up when the game starts and you can put out content faster because you know how some of the mechanics work. You can explain some of this stuff and still get the good lead and sort of take off with your channel, be it YouTube, Twitch, whatever.
Completely blame people being annoyed that they couldn't experience it. Especially when, to be honest, a good portion of all the best players in the game later on were the same players in
No, you got to consider funny points for charging someone off. Oh, of course. Well, with funny points, it's a grand slam.
closed beta, grinding in lobbies. It was very much the typical quality Blizzard testing experience, and I say that as a tester of Diablo 3, StarCraft 2, and Heroes of the Storm in alpha.
Okay.
Overwatch's launch was announced at BlizzCon 2015, as well as more information such as the fact that it would include 21 heroes and only cost $40 for the standard edition. The
Okay, this is a lot of time before we've actually gotten to the release of the game yet, though. I'm not quite sure I agree
reason
with the
for
pacing.
this is that it would be launching multiplayer only, just like Team Fortress 2. I'm sure not trying to draw any comparisons, right? But console players would kind of get shafted here, as they would have to pay the full price of the game, $60, and get a multiplayer only game.
Yeah.
Overwatch beta would come to a close December 3rd for a short break before coming back in January of
Nothing in terms of downtime.
2016. Overwatch would be during this time swirled in a controversy, if you want.
That wasn't right away. This is March? I don't remember this being right away. I remember some of the Tracer's poses too
I
not
call it
great
that.
being
Regarding
a little
certain
bit later.
Tracer pose, Blizzard was asked to remove it by many fans sensitive about a girl with some junk in the trunk. But this wouldn't mark the last of the controversies, unfortunately.
Oh no, it attracted the type of audience because it attracted so much broader of an audience. And this is the thing, Overwatch and League and lots of these games get this mark as like, these are the most toxic things ever. And they're really not the most toxic things ever. Competitive games generally are rather toxic. It's just the people who have a hardcore, older, competitive game experience are used to them being toxic, so they've grown a bit more thicker skin. It's things like Overwatch, things with like very diverse cast like this that invite in a bigger audience and therefore get in people who are not used to that toxicity and therefore go, oh my god, this is the worst thing ever, when really it's not as bad as what you would see in other shooters and such. Like, it's really not. And that's why I just sort of roll my eyes at some of the stuff. And that same sort of crowd is the type that are going to write this sort of article.
That Overwatch would find itself in.
Or complain about this sort
lore
of
and
thing.
hype was generated for Overwatch with the impressive animated shorts that would start launching
Yeah,
March
the animated shorts
2016
were
and
great.
onward.
They did
These
huge
shorts
things
were
for
so
Overwatch.
good they had the player base asking for full episodes.
I mean, there was a time when people were shopping around for options, and, you know, we could have had an Overwatch Netflix series instead of, or as well as, a League series, and it wouldn't have looked like this the whole time, but it, you know, it could have happened.
To counterbalance the fact that they were multiplayer only,
And considering there was so much plot emptiness, plot space to work in, that would have made such good content and would have been so good for the brand if they worked with them and had any ideas on plot, or were willing to let them actually set plot and not go, well, this is like the Star Wars universe where you can't break any walls or do anything because we can't have you change any of our other plans.
but not free to play, Blizzard would announce that all Overwatch content post-release, such as maps and heroes, would be free.
Yeah, the ultimate thing that forced them to release Overwatch 2, right here. This is it. March 7th, 2016. This is what sort of doomed us to need Overwatch 2 and is part of what got us our content drought for years here.
Overwatch's open beta would take place May 2016, just before its launch, where Blizzard would revel in incredible success as they would pull in 9 million players.
Yep.
Overwatch wasn't only watch anymore, available only to a select few. It was playable to millions of people, and taking over the world before it even launched. Activision Blizzard was putting the time, effort, and money to make sure that Overwatch's launch was huge.
Yeah, and they'd had experience with good and bad ones before. They had Diablo 3, that disaster of a launch. So they know what a bad launch looks like, and they have the money and resources and experience to do a good launch.
They even took the time to have a bunch of giant, oversized Overwatch characters put up across the globe, in Busan, LA, and Paris in particular.
But they're not in problematic poses.
The Overwatch that was launching May 24th, 2016, though, wasn't the same Overwatch it started as anymore. While many changes were likely due to the fact that feedback was being received and they were trying to respond to such, Blizzard would change key aspects of hero balance, and even key things such as removing the scoreboard that originally existed.
Yeah, because again, they knew they were going for a wider audience and they thought that would reduce toxicity. I disagree with that assessment, but they thought it would. People would have found the wrong things to complain about,
weren't really accounted for properly.
I think we will ultimately would have had less toxicity with a reasonable scoreboard.
Starters, the game would launch without a competitive mode, leaving how Blizzard would handle such kind of a mystery. Would they allow hero stacking, for example, or do as some of the community tournaments were doing at the time, restrict them in some way? It seemed like Blizzard.
Ah, yes, Season 1 Overwatch. There's 2 McCrees on the other team. There's 2 Tracers on the other team. Good times.
It was going to try and solve that problem after the fact, which would work if the community had a chance to evolve organically.
That was not the problem. And they were actually smart enough to take it from the community. The community kind of insisted on and ran all their tournaments in a way of, hey, we're going to do 1 hero limit, and Blizzard eventually came around to it. Now, the community also mostly said, forget it to Time Bank, and said, hey, whoever finishes faster wins sort of things, and that's, you know, when it comes to payload maps and that sort of thing. And Overwatch said, nah, we're actually going to do a different way. We're going to do multiple rounds, and you finish and you run the map again with your remaining time. And I think that worked out okay. So Overwatch in the early years of Overwatch was showing that they can do a pretty good job. They can take some feedback and use it well. They can take other feedback and go, nah, we see what you're doing, but we have actual design tools and we're going to do it like this instead.
Blizzard's 6 vs 6 hero shooter Overwatch.
What do I think would be meta if there was no hero limits? Right now, I'm actually not convinced. I'm not convinced that Sustain is strong enough right now for it to be a GOATS meta, though I know a lot of people think it would be. It could be. It would definitely use BAP if it was. It would probably drop Brig, honestly, and it would use BAP plus Zen. But I think it's more likely that we'd get something... I actually think it'd be pretty okay. I think we'd be pretty similar to what we have, and we'd have something pretty dive heavy. I think we'd see a lot of, but not permanent, double tracer. We'd probably see more monkey play because stacking monkeys is a lot more effective because that double cleave is just that big a deal. You might see a fair amount of like monkey, Zen, Brig, Genji type stuff. Like, just because the amount of if you run any squishies, we destroy you. And the existence of that might force us back into a, squishies are just too vulnerable, so we're going back to something like GOATs. And so maybe we would end up on a tank-heavy comp. Who knows?
Overwatch would launch May 24th, 2016, and score a 91 out of 100 on aggregate review website.
But that's because he has a current shot. I was gonna say, you don't get to be like, yes, 91 out of 100 when this is right here, but this is probably a more current thing that he's pulled here, and that's why this has been lowered over time. Okay, because this would have been higher, this user score back then, for sure.
Website Metacritic. Game Informer would score the game 100, stating it was fresh and consistently fun and a masterful polishing.
And did they do that so they'd get early access for a review copy for the next Blizzard Activision title? Eh? Eh?
IGN would score Overwatch a 94 out of 100, stating it was an incredible achievement in multiplayer
And did they do that so that they'd get early access and a review copy to the next Blizzard Activision copy?
shooter design. Overwatch, as positioned for, was a smash hit for Activision Blizzard, grabbing numerous awards including Game of the Year and being named Game of the Year by outlets such as Eurogamer, Game Informer, IGN, GameSpot, and The Escapist.
And it actually deserved to be Game of the Year, so like that one doesn't actually bother me. We've seen some pretty bad Game of the Years that you're just like, is money changing hand? What's going on here? I remember when Dragon Age Inquisition got Game of the Year, and I'm just like, what? Like, the game's fine, but like, Game of the Year, you're called okay.
Under just 1 month, Overwatch had reached 10 million players, immediately becoming a blockbuster hit. But while that's certainly impressive, and a measure of success, the true measure of success is the
especially for a shooter and a shooter at the time, because shooters haven't always been the most popular genre. We see them as like super popular now on Twitch. We've seen the battle royale genre really come out to play, but that wasn't really the case when Overwatch came out. Like, shooters existed, people liked their Halo, their Destiny, things like that, but they did not take over the like type of game that everyone played back then. And they're still not the type of game everyone plays. Still there's people that play MMOs, still there's people that play RPGs, but like ongoing entertainment, ongoing games that we expect to have be as services and constantly have new stuff. It wasn't firmly shooters or battle royales like it is now.
The porn scene that sprung out of nowhere for Overwatch, and
we'll
that Overwatch
skip past that for YouTube's happiness
had reached. If there were any serious issues with Overwatch, they weren't exactly apparent yet. At least not for most players.
I mean, I don't know. I think there were some pretty obviously early apparent issues. Flashbang fan roll fan was pretty darn OP for early Cassidy, early McCree, as was McSnipes, as they later went, oh, this is too powerful, so let's just make him be super range shoot. Like, there were some early issues.
The game was smashing every record imaginable, and it was hard to think of it being anything short of near perfect. But less than a month after the launch of the game, and already there were some clues for
Overwatch is great, but here's what they must fix. I mean, I don't mind if a game, again, most games I find have their best balance of all time, usually, in like that first major balance patch that follows the game's release. It tends to be a situation where the dev team's original goals, even if they've laid off, part of the dev team, most of the dev team, because they don't need to make the game anymore, they just need to maintain it and add some stuff. Even if they've done that, there's still enough of an understanding, enough people are still there. They understand what the game was supposed to be and how they wanted it to work, but they've also now had this giant test of, hey, it's been live for a month or two and people have done stuff. So I tend to find for most games, MMOs, all these sorts of things, that first patch is a really good one. So like, this isn't concerning that, oh, a month after the game's release, people are writing they have to fix stuff.
Forming about what would become of the fate of Overwatch. Questions about if Overwatch would be an esport were all over the headlines. But more importantly, if it did become an esport or more competitive shooter, would it have what it takes to become successful as such?
Yes. If they'd done it right, it would have.
You might be wondering how some of the very respectable names in esports were dubious from the start about Overwatch's future as an esport, but it's because the biggest issue in Overwatch esports, or competitive, or just watching it in general, is the most glaringly obvious.
Watchability was a huge issue from the beginning. Huge issue right from the beginning. And that's the thing, part of why, Jeff was like, hey, we didn't really design this to be an esport, but that's life. We didn't really design Fortnite to be an esport either, but Fortnite took off with an esport scene because it was the biggest game for a while. That's, some ways, just how it works.
Yes. Overwatch has an issue being discernible to experienced players in a competitive environment with a spectator mode, let alone completely new players or ones who are just not experienced enough. It's difficult during the heat of the action and team.
You buy enough ads on IGN, you're guaranteed a positive review. I mean, you don't even have to buy the ads because IGN is smart enough to know if you're ever buying ads from IGN or you have the potential of buying ads from IGN or whoever in the future. I'm not going to call it IGN specifically here, but yeah, if if you're a site, a pop culture, video game, whatever type site that has to rely on, that some of your ad buys are going to come from video game publishers or developers that you're reviewing, or maybe from Disney if you're a more pop culture type thing, like, you're always going to be sensitive to how much shade do we want to throw, because we want them to feel like they can advertise here and this is a good place for their advertisement dollars to get value, so that they spend it here rather than on a competitor. And that's a problem. That is a problem, but it's not something that we've really been able to fix, because your only other option really seems to be going the subscription model, and no one's willing to pay for subscriptions anymore. Not totally no one, but especially in the like entertainment type world, people aren't really willing to pay for subscriptions. And doing the subscription route has its own thing, because then you just hard go for your audience and you go start leaning into what they want to hear. And you can see this in the news world, where places like the New York Times, which used to be a pretty centrist, lean left paper, went harder towards its audience once it moved towards a subscription model, which is totally fine. Like, that's totally fine, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to go, hey, we want to make money, and this is what our readership wants to hear. But it does change it, just like you have video game magazines give out too high of things for that. If you go, hey, we're getting paid by our audience instead of the advertisers now you're going to have a different slant to what you put out there.
Team fights in Overwatch to discern what's going on. This leads to key impressive moments getting kind of lost in the shuffle. Early on, people thought it was just inexperienced observers, which is typically what people say, but over time it was shown that Overwatch as a game in general is difficult to understand.
I mean, it was both. The observers did get better
If you're not very familiar with it, and even then it's difficult. It's not just the abilities, it's the fact that the game is 6 versus 6 on top of all of the abilities.
Oh, that Zen positioning in GM, it hurts.
It's not a traditional deathmatch either. It's a
It
payload
hurts!
map that oftentimes turns into a capture
Maybe I'm being too snobbish about this, too snobbish about Snobby's positioning here, but
point style map, which means by literal design, there's tons of waiting around for the payload to move, for you to run out of spawn, and etc. No other esport has had such a design for a game mode.
one more time.
Means by literal design, there's tons of waiting around for the payload to move, for you to run out of spawn, and etc.
There's tons of waiting around in some other esports too. I mean, you're running laps, figuring out when, running laps to block cooldowns, to do things like, there's downtimes where there's not opponents on your screen on other things. You're just a little more constantly worried about, well, they could be there.
No other esport has had such a design for a game mode. So you have
And there's plenty of downtime in RTS as well, where it might seem like, hey, as people really get familiar, they understand what's going on in terms of this isn't a real push, this is a pressure thing. Oh, we denied the scouting, that's real. Like, denying scouting isn't really very interesting to watch in StarCraft 2, unless you actually understand what it means. But we understand what it means, or people quickly learn to understand what it means. So, like, but to a normal observer, that just looks like downtime.
all of these abilities, the shooter parts of Overwatch thrown in there with hit scans and projectile-based characters alike, and the non-typical shooter game modes all contribute.
Overwatch is one of the lower ones? What? I think they mean from an observer perspective. From a play perspective, Overwatch has very little downtime compared to other shooters because you respawn when you get eliminated. But from an observer perspective, a watcher perspective, you just move on to someone else if someone gets eliminated for the duration of the round. So that doesn't feel like downtime to you. I think that's what he means.
Contributing to a recipe of poor visual clarity during esports and competitive play.
No, visual clarity got worse over time, unfortunately. Some of it is their game just started running worse. You can see the FPS up here in the corner. Like, this started going down because they stopped optimizing as well. Unfortunate. Other stuff was they did start adding more visual clutter. Like, okay, we're going to have Moira's Coalescence Ultimate. We're going to rework Sim to have this wall that just splits the screen. Like, okay, that's more visual clutter than was originally in the game. And we kept adding more of it to the point where you're just like, okay, there's 2 Kamehamehas going on, plus a Sim wall, plus a Blizzard, plus a Death Blossom. I don't know what's going on to you. I mean, I do, but yeah.
Contrast this with a classic sport where the concept is simple. It's just get the ball.
Is this saying MOBA creep farming is not slow gameplay? Right. I think there's a little bit more of, again, you understand in that, hey, denying the enemy their last hits, pushing them back in their lane a little bit, or, or luring them in so your jungler can gank them. Like, ooh, that's exciting to watch. That's only exciting to watch as you get deeper into it and your audience starts to learn what's actually going on. But the audience did eventually learn what was going on in Overwatch 2.
On the goal, or other shooter esports where it's just like kill the other guys or plant the bomb.
I agree there's observation issues, I just don't think he's covering the right ones.
But it's also still technically kill the enemy team. These are way easier to understand and visually see take place. This wasn't some death curse though for Overwatch. It didn't need to be an esport. Team Fortress 2, the game in many ways it was emulating, had an esports scene but was almost entirely community run.
Okay.
There could still be a scene for Overwatch to have a similar thing, regardless if it was created right away, or artificially through the outside investment or expectation.
Okay.
But with ESL announcing a
I'm glad that you agree that it could have happened either way, because that seems to be a different take than what we've seen earlier.
6-figure tournament for Overwatch June 2016, it's hard to imagine the game was going to have much of a choice not being shepherded into becoming a competitive esport.
Okay.
One $100,000 tournament, not technically even officially supported by Blizzard anyway, wasn't enough to push the esports scene too quickly necessarily, sure. But it wasn't going to help matters, as the game and its popularity, regardless if it should be an esport, would attract players and interests. Remember, within a month it had 10 million players. But if Blizzard decided to fully commit to esports without correcting some of their design issues we have outlined already, or updating their approach, it might be relegated to becoming a Tier 2 or Tier 3 esport.
Okay. Sure.
Not worthy of the stature and success that the game shares.
I'm curious exactly
And
how we're
worse,
defining those. Like, what do we mean by Tier 2 or Tier 3 esport, and what at the time would have been the breaks? Because, like, if you think about esports, do we consider, like, the top 3 esports Tier 1? Because, like, the fall off gets pretty hard pretty fast. Once you go past, like, the 10th most popular esport to watch, it's minimal. It's tiny, the amount of scene that these games have. So I think it was always, like, if your Tier 1 includes the top 10, Overwatch was definitely always going to be in it and still is. If your Tier 1 was top 3, sure, it might have been Tier 2 or Tier 3. But, like, I think we act like there's a lot more real esports than there are. Like, yes, game might have a little bit of an esports scene, but if it doesn't have much viewership, doesn't have much money in it, like,
That could start to cause some serious damage if their design started to shift to appeal to that competitive audience, even for a modicum amount, because the sea of non-competitive esport players in Overwatch is the overwhelming majority of them.
Yeah, but that's true for everything. Like, the sea of people, if we want to go back to Blizzard games, the sea of people that played World of Warcraft The Burning Crusade was ginormous. The sea of people that got into Black Temple was tiny. But the existence of Black Temple was like motivation and like, oh, I want to take down Illidan. That would be really cool. I want to get Warglaives. I want to go see these bosses. I want to go do this stuff. That served as like motivation to most of the player base, even if they would never get there. So like, I don't buy that argument of, oh, having the existence of a top scene or doing any of your balancing for the top scene or doing a significant portion of your your development work for the top of the scene is just bad for the low part of for the more average parts of your game. Like, that doesn't have to follow. It really doesn't. And the top of your game is also going to get more watched than the middle part of your game. The top of your game is going to have the middle portion of your game base, the lower portion of your game base, watching it more frequently than the middle pieces. That is how it works. There is that, oh, I have a dream, I have an aspire, I want to see this, ooh, and in any game, people are going to look at the top meta to figure out what they should be doing. That is not an Overwatch unique problem. When people talk about, oh, well, the meta in GM is to go ball or maybe to go double shield, but the meta in Silver should be to use Reinhardt or whatever. The meta in Silver probably shouldn't be to use Reinhardt, whatever, but let's say that should actually be the meta, whatever. Okay. It's still not unusual that you're going to have a lot of people looking up at the top thing and go, I want to try to mimic that in almost every game. That's not really bad to have your development spent like that. Now, there's ways to do it carefully, so it's not a complete, hey, we're going to 100% bounce around the top with no consideration whatsoever for what it does for the rest of the game. Like, Reaper's bad in the top of the game, so let's just make Reaper better and better and better. Reaper's fine. Reaper's okay right now. But, like, earlier versions of Reaper were pretty darn terrible at the top of the game, and you did want to be careful on how you buffed it. You didn't want to buff him in ways that made him just destroy the game. But you can have some consideration for not destroying the game while still balancing around the top, if that's what you want to do. But hey. Temporal with the hit after it this week. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Banana Split.
Them. Overwatch was marching on ahead with incredible success, scoring $269 million in digital revenue, most likely being primarily from loot boxes present in the game, something that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, they were the Trojan horse that were able to get loot boxes and microtransactions into the mainstream and AAA titles without a hard pushback from the video game community.
Overwatch had a base game price and would allow you to gain skins from just playing the game and gaining the gold. But they would also allow you to purchase a loot box, which had the chance to drop a rare skin. The loot boxes being so closely associated with the game marketed towards children, though, is kind of what rubs people the wrong way.
Was Overwatch that heavily marketed towards children? I mean, it uses an aesthetic that allows it to get under some, more adult rating systems. It doesn't go hard with the blood, things like that, but I don't know that I agree that Overwatch was marketed that heavily towards children.
But the success of doing such was undeniable, ushering in the age of the loot box, really. Korea, a market known as not being controversial.
Any level of using animation, and they did effectively use animation style rather than as humanoid, as realistic as they could look with it for their characters, does not necessarily mean you're courting a child audience.
With the subject of microtransactions or loot boxes, by the end of June 2016, was having Overwatch overtake League and PC bangs across the nation, truly signifying either a change of guard or a new player on the scene.
I'm glad he included that. A lot of people forget that it was back and forth between League of Legends and Overwatch for a while there. What? Is this real? Is League about to get dethroned?
Impressive, even if it
hard to believe now.
Was a temporary,
especially with League having recently shot back up there, though it never really fell that hard. It just didn't have first place locked in hard. Now it's really shot back up there, and what was I saying? Overwatch has fallen pretty far.
Affair.
This video is premature. I agree, it's a little premature, but he's doing it because he wants to make sure that he doesn't miss the window, because as the hype builds for Overwatch 2, this would seem more out of place in some ways, of more people are playing Overwatch in preparation for Overwatch 2 once we hear more about Overwatch. So I understand why I targeted here, which is why, my thumbnail is sort of what it is, of maybe not, and then the devs give us a patch that says, yeah, we're gonna thwack you on the head. Or maybe it was just a Monty Python reference, because I felt like referencing Monty Python. One of the two.
While not everyone is against loot boxes morally, it should be acknowledged that sort of right under people's noses, Activision Blizzard made a fortune off of loot boxes and putting them in a casual children's shooter game. But I guess it's just perspective and all.
Again, I'm not sure about this children's thing.
Alright. Overwatch would not...
I'm gonna need a little more evidence for, this was marketed specifically towards children. What was it, really? Do children regularly go, hey, I want to play the old grandma lady with a sniper rifle? I don't know about that.
Only get a new hero in their first major update, Anna?
There is an element of people leaving and wanting it to be bad after, if you leave a party early and hope people didn't have more fun after you left. Yeah, for sure. There's a fair degree of everyone once visited these games that get covered in this, and then there's and then they're video game tourists and they go somewhere else, and they want to say, I left because the game got bad or started to get bad, and it only got worse afterwards. When again, we've had some of the best balance in Overwatch in its entire life in the last year.
A unique, precise sniper-based healer, they would get a number of balance changes. Most
the beginning of power creep,
some balance changes that would also be affecting the new competitive mode. That's concerning hero stacking. Blizzard had taken a stance finally on restricting such in ranked play,
which was
not
fine.
Allowing you to play all of the same class, or even more than one. The problem is that now you can't even have two of the same hero, which severely limits the game's options even with 22 to 23 heroes, but also
not that severe of a limitation.
Simultaneously isn't a good look, because it goes back to what we said previously. Why is Blizzard deciding this important kind of stuff so last minute?
Because they released their game without a competitive mode. Are we forgetting that Blizzard was released with only quick play? Or that this game was released with only quick play? Competitive wasn't a thing. We were in this, we're gonna do quick play. Oh yeah, I guess we can do competitive now. And that... They added things... this was a game, and it was very clear that this was a game that was released with the shards of what was left over from Project Titan. Like, they didn't know, oh, do we want this to be, and we can see the design elements, we've talked about this before, of like, this wasn't originally supposed to have a solo queue competitive. This was supposed to have I'm just gonna do queue there. This was supposed to have quick play, and then a group queue. That was the plan, but market forces be market forces forced this. So, like, yeah, this stuff was going to be weird.
According to Jeff Kaplan, the reason being initially the team had developed a team-only competitive queue mode.
Someone else covered this. I thought like I was the only one that remembered this information. Thank goodness.
Meaning you can only queue in competitive.
And the game was designed with that in play, guys. Like, the game doesn't feel right with a solo queue because, like, you can't solve enough problems, especially with Roadlock, when your teammates don't work with you. Like, there's too many strategies that are easier to execute for one side than the other, than it is for the other side to break them. Too much stuff like that. There's too much, like, we're depending on synergies that really does. This game needs a team queue, and you have to play it in a team queue more so than a game like League, to be honest.
As a full team. The idea was that, as Jeff Kaplan stated, the best way to play the game ultimately was as a full team, as it was designed, but also seemed to reduce toxicity and difficulty finding a quality match as a player.
For sure.
The feedback was apparently very negative regarding such, though.
No, because players hate that. Players want to go, no, I want to play video games when I want to play video games, and I am playing video games, whatever. I just want to do this on my own, and I want to have a ladder that tells me how good I am. I want the validation. I don't want other people getting carried, whatever, and that's just a shame. Again, I think this could have been a huge cult following game if it had been like, no, we're sticking to our guns, we're doing team. Again, we would not have reached the highs that it did reach, but it could have, but we wouldn't be at these lows either. We would have just been like, okay, we're going to start here, we're going to fall to here, and we're going to be pretty happy here the whole way through. Like, this game would have had a cult following if it had stuck to that.
Whatever that means exactly. I'm not sure. But
I think with 5 players, it'll be a little easier to incorporate that. That's not the direction they're going, though, with 5 players. With the 5-player direction, they're trying to go in a more standard multiplayer game where you have more ability to frag back out in 1v3s, that sort of thing. You can clearly tell that that's their game decision design, and that's most games' game decision design, by the way. They're much less team-based, even when you play in teams, than Overwatch is, and Overwatch 2 is trying to move it in that direction. That's, tank synergy is one of the most powerful synergies in the game, and they've removed it.
Response was bad enough that it, at the very least, scared the Overwatch team from pursuing such further. I, however, think Jeff and the team were kind of right in their idea.
Hey, Nerd Slayer, let's go grab a drink. We have a discussion to have.
Obviously, hindsight being 2020. They should have trusted the idea despite negative feedback. That's because ultimately, as many of you guys know, as we will discuss shortly, Overwatch would suffer from a slew of toxicity issues.
No, it doesn't. It's got a perceived toxicity issue because it's more inclusive in who it brought in the first place, and those people are coming from MMOs, are coming from RPGs, are coming from RTSs, are coming from other game types where they're not used to having toxic teammates. For an FPS type game, this is not terribly toxic. For a high-level competitive game, this is not terribly toxic. It's just brought in players that aren't used to that.
Email you a picture of my hairy dick.
Hanzo, can you even...
I've won Apex matches even when one of our 3 players left at the start. Right, because Apex, like most games, is designed a little more around, hey, solo carry potential.
that arrow of where they fucking are.
Okay, I'm gonna jump past that.
So now I know what the...
I'm gonna jump past that as well.
Carrying the
Different game even.
I know that you're all thinking he was able to get away with it, but he's a bigger channel than me, and there's a little bit of a degree of, how do I want to put this? There's a little bit of a degree of, manual review type thing, and I can get a manual review, and 50% of the time it'll go my way, and 50% I won't, and it's going to go his way a bit more often than it goes my way. Just because, oh, well, there's actually more ad money to be made off of this video, etc. And world isn't fair, what else is new?
Overwatch 6 vs 6 with a full team on comms was how the game was meant to be played. But by
Yep.
not having a full team-based queue, or at least the option for it, or even the
No, you didn't need the option for it. It needed to be the only way to queue competitive. You could queue quick play and warm up and do whatever you want, like going out and playing basketball, just going, hey, I'm going to go out to the court on the streets and play some basketball. But your real games are with your high school, with your college, with your rec team, with the NBA, whatever. Like, that's how this needed to be.
The tools to create such, Overwatch was opting for a far more simple and accessible, regular ranked format. This was actually proving problematic for Overwatch because it was suffering from immense toxicity issues, and that was related to how the game was designed.
He's not big enough to actually not follow the rules. Like, he's not actually that big. He's like 250,000, 300,000, something like that, but that's still an order of magnitude larger than my channel is.
Because Overwatch, as Kaplan himself admitted, is focused on being a team-focused game. When it isn't a full team experience, there's way more room for error and lack of team synergy. While that's pretty typical in most games, in Overwatch the game was night and day different with an organized team.
Right, because again, the game was literally designed, guys, for this level of team play, and I do not think people understand, in large part, like, how much you make design decision differences and how much Overwatch has to be changed for Overwatch 2, or if it can even be changed enough to make it have that, oh, you have teammates, and yes, having 5 people alive versus 4 people alive, or having better teammates is better, but like, if I'm good enough, I can frag back into a 1v3. Like, I don't think people understand how much Overwatch was designed in this team aspect.
Versus people just trying to play team deathmatch, which is kind of how most matches would end up. This leads to more toxicity issues, as players get frustrated when their team doesn't work with them, and then when the scoreboard's hidden, you don't even know what you're scoring really, or even your teammates are scoring in relation
Yeah, but the scoreboard would have always not shown the right things
to you.
I still think we could have had better with one, but it would have always been the scoreboard would have, yes, been used for toxicity, but it also would have solved some toxicity. And I'll go for more information, not less.
And Blizzard only put that in because they thought that that would curb toxicity, but it accomplished essentially the opposite. As now you have no objective measure to know how you or your teammates are even performing.
Sure. My objective measure is I know I'm right, but yeah, most of you don't have that. Most of you weren't professional Overwatch coaches.
Sure, you have the limited stats that they give you, but those aren't good enough. And to make matters worse, the new competitive mode was based on skill rating, which is conflicted, because it only slightly rewards your personal play while giving you a big penalty for losing.
It has to. It has to not have most of it be related to your individual play. It has to much more heavily be tied to the win versus the loss. Like, I would actually be fine with completely abolishing performance SR, especially at this point in the game's life cycle. Maybe not at this point in the game's life cycle because there's so much smurfing going on, but there was definitely a window in the game's life where we could have abolished it, and that would have been a better, cleaner, more truthful ladder. You really do want it tied to winning versus losing. Otherwise, you get into issues like Mercy's will run into issues where it's like, oh, hey, the game is expecting you to heal more because that's what Mercy's at and above your rank do, but that's not actually what you should be doing type stuff. Like, it's really not great. Or, oh, you as a tank are losing too much, you are dying too much because you're feeding as Winston, whatever, but the truth is every time you're feeding, your Genji is getting a double kill and winning the team fight, and you're recognizing that and you're going, I'm going to continue to feed hard. Now, if you're a better Winston, could you avoid it and still set him up for the double kill every time? Why, yes, you could. But are you as good as the Winston who is finding ways to tickle, not putting as much pressure on, but not dying as much? You actually are, you just have different skill sets, that sort of thing, but whatever.
In a super team-based game. You can imagine how that
Season 1 rating book drove me nuts. I hear ya.
can lead to even more frustration for players, as some feel like there's little way to personally influence the course of a game compared to nearly every other competitive shooter on the market. Blizzard was aware of the toxicity problems, but they had committed to their course of action, and whether or not it would actually curtail or stop toxicity remained to be seen, but was doubtful, because the core issue, aka the game design, wasn't being solved.
Right. It's a game design, like, the game design issue got us toxicity because we needed to go for team queue, and also because the game design style brought in a player base that did not have the thicker skin from having, grown up in Halo lobbies.
Perhaps had Blizzard done a better job introducing players to each other and forming teams with each other, some of the toxicity issues could have been alleviated, but they would unfortunately plague Overwatch from the beginning of the game throughout most of its life cycle. Ooh,
some Overwatch jams.
Almost as if fate had things planned out already, or just a desire to make a lot of money, Blizzard announced an Overwatch League November 4th, 2016, just a few months after launch. If Kaplan's initial approach was wait for the community to grassroots it, then the new approach was throwing an entire bathtub of gasoline onto the fire and watching it explode in delight. Blizzard wouldn't just be announcing a single tournament either, but an entire professional league meant to emulate real sports with franchising city-based teams and all.
And it could have been brilliant. Truth be told, it really could have been brilliant. But I'm sure he's going to go over why he thinks it wasn't.
Nate Nanzer, the global director of esports on Overwatch, would outline a path to pro,
Nate
which meant
got
to emulate the real.
Nate went with, hey, Overwatch is having some success, I'm going to go get a bigger paycheck somewhere else, and good for him.
Professional sports leagues, too. What kind of sports leagues decides what the rules are, though, and fixes the infrastructure after the fact?
Well, that's not really the problem. The problem is the same issue that the Olympics had when they reviewed esports, where they went, you know, we don't really want you to both, we don't really want to host you in the Olympics when the publisher still has the ability to change the game, change the rules, whatever. Like, that doesn't really work for us. And there is that of, hey, you're both hosting the tournament and setting the rules and changing it. Like, it is too much concentrated power there.
After they launched the league, for example. Well, none. But to be fair, sports leagues aren't popping up all the time exactly either. To create an entire league, it's going to take an entire ecosystem of support pieces, professional players, sponsors, broadcast partners, and etc. This isn't just some online tournament or single LAN, it's a series of local LANs in each particular franchise, region, and city. Blizzard
with some earlier stuff
trying to do such seemingly overnight.
Like when Corey was on Justice, the European Paris Eternal there, sure.
Boatloads of money or not, was going to be difficult. They were first going to need franchise teams to sign up, and the slots were very likely going to cost them millions. Rumors would circulate over the supposed franchise teams, with talks of the Patriots owner Robert Kraft and the New York's Mets COO Jeff Wilpon.
Sure.
Los Angeles, Miami, San Francisco, Shanghai, and Seoul would all be franchise team options as well. 7 teams isn't exactly enough to create an entire league, but Blizzard was firm in asking for $20 million for a franchise slot.
Well, they had to be firm, because the way that they got this league to work was they did a handshake deal with what, the Patriots Kraft, and they went, and that deal was, I will pay 20 million or I will pay the amount, whichever is lower, of 20 million or the amount that the whatever team gets into the league least pays. So if someone else gets into the league for 7 million, that's what he's going to pay. If someone else gets into the league for 15 million, that's what he's going to pay. And that deal was fine because they were able to use that to say, hey, see, someone did buy a slot for 20 million, to then go, you know, this guy who said I'll do 20 million or lower. They were able to use that for sales reasons effectively to go, hey, this is what it costs, it's 20 millions, and it worked. But that did mean that's what it was going to be. Like, they couldn't really lower the price. Siegel just yesterday said that rushing to judgment about organized league is often wrong. The league with contract minimum and various fringe benefits allowed a lot of people to play this game. Completely agree. I'm completely on the same page of the issue with Overwatch League is not like hugely this, oh, we tore out the grassroots system and we put a bunch of money into it rather than letting the grassroots try to grow to this side. This was not strictly wrong, especially when you can't count on a game having a particularly long lifespan these days. You don't expect when you release a game, even a massively popular game, for it to stick around for 20 years like StarCraft as an esport did, because the video game release infrastructure is faster now. There's so many more games to pick from that people move on. Older games are going to hold on as esports for longer than newer games will. And if you understand that, you sort of need to create the flash in the pan moment with money, or accept that your value cap is going to be, you're going to slowly build your grassroots organization and it's going to get to here and go for a bit 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 and then tunnel out like that, as opposed to, hey, let's go like, I don't really want my highlighter, I want my actual pen, as opposed to, hey, let's do our grassroots scene, whatever, and then, nope, you know, hard straight line it up to here and then go like this. And then maybe, okay, type thing. Like that sort of thing. That's fine.
There was reportedly fair profit sharing
Thank
from
you,
the
Adam.
league to the teams, and then the players. But how on earth was Blizzard going to sell
Well, no, the players weren't really getting profit sharing. The players had contracts.
$20 million slots when there wasn't even really an esports scene for Overwatch yet?
Well, the first way they were going to do it is they were going to sell broadcast rights to Amazon Twitch for millions and millions of dollars, and then if you share 50% of that with the teams, you've actually made your league totally work and totally reasonable for the first 2 years, no problem.
With
Like, I'm not kidding. That contract was huge for making everything work.
salaries for pros at a minimum of $50,000, I was happy for my friends getting paid for being amazing at the game, as they should. But I was worried back when this was announced because there weren't any examples of esports being artificially created and then being successful. There just isn't. It's been done over and over again. It doesn't work.
It hasn't been done that many times. It's been done a couple times. It has been done a couple times, and it has massively failed, and that has scared people off from trying to do it again. Overwatch actually could have made it work this time. It didn't fail because they massively pumped it with money. It failed for other reasons that I still expect them to get to.
There also wasn't enough
And if he
information
doesn't,
about the
I'll cover
challenger amateur scene and the path to pro options that were mentioned either, which made the whole Overwatch esports thing feel even more forced. At the end of the day, the game might have been competitive, but what did it have to be an esport? And why did it necessarily have the markings of being the best one? So far, no signs of that. But investors were trusting in Activision Blizzard's vision anyway, especially as Overwatch eclipsed 30 million players.
Sure.
They must have figured, well, a lot of players surely means that that's going to translate into a lot of viewers, right?
Okay,
Hello,
let's see what happens.
I'd like to welcome you to this video's sponsor.
Okay, we don't care about your sponsorship. Maybe that's mean of us, but we don't care about your sponsorship. There we go.
A damage-based character who can hack an enemy and disable their abilities.
Sure.
In March 2017 and July 2017, two new heroes would heavily change the balance of the game in a way I don't think Blizzard anticipated.
Orisa
With the
and
addition of
Doomfist. What do we
Orisa,
got?
a new powerful shield tank, and Doomfist, a powerful damage dealer with a near one-hit kill combo.
I mean, he does have a one-hit ability against squishies, and he has a near one-hit combo as well, but he does actually have a one-hit ability.
Orisa would push the meta even more into a shield-based tank meta, making shields even more powerful.
What timeline are you on, buddy? Orisa wasn't played very often after release. Like, it took forever for people to get to Orisa. We had a couple people like Gesture who were surprisingly good at Orisa because they were good at comboing their ults with Dragon Strikes and other things, much better than the rest of the tank player base. But Orisa did not see early and often play. She was kind of a rare pick.
Including being able to place a shield now on the ground. Shields are, simply speaking, not very fun to watch for spectators, and not that fun to shoot at for most players, despite being incredibly important to break.
Excuse me? Oh, right. You played Overwatch for like 3 months or a year, 5 years ago. Whatever. They're not all that important to break. Not in most metas. Early in the game, people put a lot of pressure on breaking them, things like that, but angles beat breaking shields. Angles beat breaking shields. Yes, you should generally shoot at a shield rather than reload, but yes, wearing down a shield does help make a team less comfortable, but no, you do not go, oh, we better break that shield before we shoot at that other team. It's really important to break that shield. No, it's not. I'm gonna take angles and shoot around the shield. An Orisa barrier, I don't want to destroy that. That's just work. I'm gonna go around that. I'm gonna dive through that.
It's one of the most frustrating parts about Overwatch is that you have to tell your teammates and explain to them that they need to break shields.
Oh boy. No, they don't. Teammates, you do not have to break shields. Take angles. You do not have to break shields. Use cover. Use physical hard cover. It's like this infinite health shield that the opponents can't break, and take angles.
But who wants to sit there shooting at shields the whole game, breaking them?
Cannot believe this. Really? You have other takes in here that I don't agree with, but this downgrades the quality of this video so much for being so wrong. And it is an understanding that is from years and years ago. 4-year ago understanding, and wasn't even fully bought into by players back then. Ugh.
kind of nobody. Doomfist as well just made the game feel less like a shooter and more like a MOBA.
Like, even when Double Shield was the meta, you'll notice that people basically immediately adapted by going, hey, let's use Doomfist and dive through the shield. Oh, hey, what do you know? That's a good idea. No, we don't break shields. Sorry, teammates. Temporal said I wasn't allowed to shoot at the shield. There you go. That's not quite what I said. Shooting at the shield is better than reloading for most heroes. For Anna, she might just choose to reload instead, but hey.
Which would...
In Silver, we shoot at shields all the time. In Silver, you guys think Reinhardt is supposed to stand in the middle of the choke because it's a Reinhardt shield-sized choke and that people are supposed to stand behind the Reinhardt. Never mind, they don't actually stand behind the Reinhardt, but they still scream that they need one, but hey.
Become a gradual shift from this point on, especially with many hit-scan heroes like McCree or Cassidy and Soldier 76 being repeatedly nerfed.
20 damage Soldier 76 says what? 225 health Cassidy with aerial roll says what? Cassidy pre-hit scan total nerf says what?
Now Doomfist was even more powerful due to these nerfs, and due to the fact that he required a team to deal with them, taking advantage of the game's design. While Orisa and Doomfist would complicate the meta imbalance,
she was irrelevant on release. She was good, but she was irrelevant on release because people didn't play her and the meta did not shape around her. He was reasonable on release. He actually did make some adjustments, did do some stuff in Apex tournaments because that is what we're talking about. We've gone out of order in our release cycle here, and I'm not sure why. Doomfist was in the game long before Overwatch League started, but like he was reasonable. He caused some adjustments to the way that the game was played, don't get me wrong, but he was not as overpowered as we saw later when you'd start seeing, we've had later metas that Doomfist showed up in where it's like, that's where some of the clips where it's like, oh, let's see, Agilities is doing Hanamura a second to defense and he just got 9 eliminations as Doomfist. Like, what is this nonsense? That sort of thing. He wasn't that powerful on release either. He's a sink or swim hero. Most of the time he's been a sink hero. On release he was somewhat a swim hero, but he wasn't like I'm swimming downstream with jet propulsion, etc. He was hey, I can swim, I can stay above water hero.
Balancing, I don't think they were nearly as problematic as the next 3 heroes to come later that year going into the next.
Okay.
Kaplan would promise harsher penalties for toxic players and urge players to use the report features to try and discourage toxic players.
Okay, we can dream.
But Blizzard's unwillingness to ban accounts was on full display.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing. Like, we're gonna make people believe that we'll punish you for being toxic, and hopefully that'll be enough of a deterrent to cause you to not be toxic, and that's not how it works. They needed to actually be doing real bans, and they weren't. They were, by and large, just doing silences, but also, it really becomes a thing of you get into some degree of what level of toxicity is going to be allowed, because there is some level of should you be able to flame someone a little bit for just not playing the game correctly at all? Or should they get to be, no, you can't tell me how to play the game whatsoever, when they just run their Bastion down main at the enemy all the time and never take an off angle, never use a surprise angle, that sort of thing. Or they pick Bastion when no one on your team is willing to support a Bastion strat, that sort of thing. So there was always going to be you guys really don't want to play moderator in that. You have to let the community figure it out, and the best solution to that would have been teams in the first place. And in the modern era of 2022, we're kind of firmly in a mindset, I would say, of you don't get to tell off the Bastion that hard, you don't get to cuss him out for not playing the game the way the other 5 of you want to, etc. But honestly, in like 2017, culturally, the world and video game players were probably more split on that.
And many examples of them offering temporary bans on even some of the most egregious defenders. They would eventually introduce competitive mode bans, but even then the toxic players can just play quick play, so you're not really getting rid of them. Blizzard not being firm on toxicity and dedication.
Well, toxicity is, again, it's a little bit of a tricky thing to define there. Like, who's being toxic? Because the person who's playing the hero that no one wants them to play, who's playing the hero in a way that doesn't work, is the player, who, or is the player who is, trying to use, we'll say, verbal force to go, no, play in the way we want. Let's use some group pressure to move you. Well, what if the group is wrong? Well, what if the individual is right? Well, what if the individual is wrong and the group is right? Like, that was always going to be almost impossible to police unless you just said, well, no bad words. And if you just say, well, no bad words, that's sort of like, okay, that's okay, but that's not really going to go back to the shooter roots that are some of the people that came back here and highly competitive stuff, which is going to have some backing of, hey, you treat competitive sports, you treat things like that as if you need to communicate in battlefield conditions where you have to communicate quickly and there's not time to, well, let me sit down and have a discussion with you. And yes, I see your point of view. And let me say this because of this. There's not time to do that in competitive situations. So people get a little more crass, a little faster in how they communicate, that sort of thing. The best Torb player in the world got banned for one-tricking Torb at one point. Yep. Top Torb player did get banned for playing Torb.
The resources needed, as the article would compare them to League of Legends, which had an entire team dedicated to toxicity, and you still get cancer anyway, but anyway, are also huge contributors to the game facing issues. Sure, as we discussed already, the very design of the game can create these toxicity issues, but if the toxicity does happen and is spotted and you still aren't really stopping it, that's obviously going to create problems too.
Again, toxicity isn't a great word. Like, I understand it's necessary and I understand what he's talking about in broad strokes, but like, people are going to have different thresholds for what do we consider toxic versus tryharding, that sort of thing.
Can we please, for the love of God, just get on the point?
That wasn't over the line toxic for me. That doesn't actually help you win, but that wasn't over the line toxic, for example.
Use the tanks to charge. Christ.
Yeah, that, like, he's having a bad day. That's hurting his team, not helping them win, but I'm definitely not reporting anything there.
If you're wondering why we're dedicating so much time to esports portion of Overwatch in this video too, it's because we did something similar in the Heroes of the Storm video. And simply speaking, Blizzard has done this before. They have tried to force an esport and it failed epically. That failure takes resources.
Yeah, no, it does. That's fair. I think the failure of the esport in some ways is important for talking about the failure of the game because resources went to it, balanced decisions went around it. There are things that happened there. I think it is reasonable to talk about it because they are pretty heavily intertwined.
Focus, and above all else, can affect.
Though, yes, it would have been possible for the game to succeed even if the esport hadn't been over the top successful.
The base experience of the game. If Blizzard fails again with forcing an esport on Overwatch, it's going to be a huge blow.
People who report BMing are lame, I hear you.
To their game's community and success. With a hefty 40-game schedule ahead for each of the now 12 teams by November 2017, and $1 million on the line, it was.
I'm okay with that, guys. The 40-game schedule was never the problem. Seriously, it wasn't. The problem was that all the teams with their 40-game schedule went, we need to prepare for these like we prepared for when there was, one tournament a month type thing where we'd scrim 6 days a week, double scrim blocks of 4 hours a day. So we do 24 hours of scrimming each week. Like, no. You're going to need rest days. You're going to need later travel days. You're going to need to make sure that your team's got its physical health together. Like the Overwatch League players and the Overwatch League coaches and the Overwatch League teams, especially that we're losing, were so insistent on, hey, we're practicing 12 hours a day. You can't stop us. Don't be upset with us because we're trying hard and, we're sorry that we're losing, but we're trying hard and that's our defense. And it's like, no, I don't care. 40 games is fine. 40 games per team is fine. Not every game was going to be watched. Not every game was supposed to be watched by every fan. But, the teams had to adjust to reality, and they didn't because they weren't run terribly well. And some of that is a shame because you did get professional teams involved, like ownerships of professional physical sport teams involved that should have known better, but they mostly weren't the coaches and the managers. They were in sales positions or ownership positions, or league contacts type positions rather than more directly tied to the team. And that caused a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds to go, well, working harder has to be the solution. No, working harder is not the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting more hours in is not strictly the solution. Putting
was full steam ahead.
If anything, this past season was really skimpy. Right. We've gone less and less games each season, and it's sort of like, this certainly isn't baseball. This certainly isn't basketball in terms of what we're watching anymore in terms of the number of games.
Head for Overwatch Esports with a cool new 200 million.
And again, you don't get to prep for specific teams. Like, if you watch basketball, if you talk to top basketball teams, they're not changing their strategy when they're up against the Warriors versus when they're up against the Lakers versus when they're up against whoever. Like, they're not doing that. What they're doing is they have basically one or two ways that they play the game, and they're going to play that game that way for the regular season, and then they'll start going, hey, now we'll start adjusting. Now that we have some breaks between playoff teams, we'll start adjusting how we play defense, adjusting our overall strategy for specific teams because we have time to do that for the playoffs. But Overwatch League teams are like, no, we have to practice for every single team. We have to scout this team. We have to know that their diva sometimes goes here 1 in 10 times, so we're going to have a Junkrat trap over there. Oh, we know that their Tracer 1 in 12 times will go over here, so we need to make sure that we properly scout that and have our Tracer watching that. What are you doing? What are you doing? That is not an efficient use of time. I would so much rather that your player, learn that, 1 in 10 times the diva goes there, that your player go, hey, go spend some time in the weight room. Hey, go blow off some steam. Hey, go literally do aim drills. Like, anyway. If you're a Boston fan, you got to see them play, 16 games over 6 months? Exactly. Totally unacceptable.
And sponsorships from HP, Toyota, T-Mobile, and Spotify in tow.
Yeah, and that was a big deal. They pumped this league up to a high level, but they got top-tier sponsorships. Those are top-tier sponsorships that he just talked about there, where everyone knows who those companies are. Now, there's a little bit of a problem of a lot of those companies are trying to do business in the West. They're not doing a ton of business in South Korea or in China when we later added leagues there. And that becomes a little bit of an issue for a global league. There was always going to be a little bit of an issue, though maybe we didn't know it at the time for a global league, of what are you doing with your sponsorships, or are you going to do sponsorships in such a way where you're doing different sponsorships on your Chinese broadcast than on your US broadcast? That was always going to be a little bit of a thing. I think you can tie your sponsorships up that are appealing enough to both North America and Europe, but it was always going to be a little hard to go, here's your North American sponsor. Advertising in China just isn't worth anything to them, if they're even allowed to, and Chinese advertisers in North America, again, much the same issue there.
In the beginning of 2018, the news cycle would be focused on Overwatch League and the competitive gameplay in order to get the game ready for esports. With more than 10 million across multiple platforms tuning into the league, Blizzard was in position to capitalize on the success and hope it's more than just a one-time thing. Just 1 or 2 big events, though, isn't enough to become the next big esport, nor is it enough to rival sports leagues. For reference, NFL games are pulling tens of millions of viewers every game.
And going down year after year. There's a reason that you're actually looking at some of these cable channels that are going, wait, we paid this much for these contracts? Oh, shoot. Oh, we could have better deployed that money elsewhere. We could have better deployed that money into college football. Like, the value of these are going down, and a lot of them are having buyer's remorse, much like Amazon had buyer's remorse on, buying the broadcast rights for Overwatch League.
Not just the Super Bowl. Merely a few months later, though, and sponsors were already worried as Overwatch's toxicity issues were spilling over into competitive play.
Oh, back when they were worried about, hey, sometimes your players BM each other. Remember when sponsors were worried about that? I forgot all about that after some of the more recent sponsorship pullouts related to Blizzard, but hey.
Blizzard was still able to score a broadcasting deal with Twitch, though, at the last second, May 2018. To make matters worse, the big question mark over the path to pro stuff that we mentioned previously wasn't alleviated, especially when news came out in October of 2018 that Blizzard would be canceling any offline tournaments for the Contenders League, stopping amateurs from getting crucial lane experience. Blizzard was also...
Yeah, that's the problem. So again, something that we ran into here is Overwatch tried to follow the baseball model where you have, let me get a different color there because I'm writing on that. Overwatch mostly tried to follow the Major League Baseball model, and the Major League Baseball model goes, hey, we're going to have our professional teams, we'll have our 30 teams here, it's great, whatever, fine. Oh, hey, that matches up reasonably well with Overwatch League later, whatever, we're fine with that. But then we're going to have AAA, AA, single A, and we'll just call this Tier 2 and Tier 3. Or top tier 3, whatever you want to do here. And that's fine. An MLB would be the equivalent of OWL. And that's fine. No real issue with that. I suppose I should have flipped the orders of these, except that the reason that MLB makes sense to have AAA and AA is strictly that players have free agency and players have, how do I want to put this, contracts that are worth so much money that having a player play for you for 5 years, 7 years, depends on when we're talking about era of baseball, having a player play for you at effectively a locked-in rate because they came up from AAA for years, going, hey, you're going to play for league minimum for us for years, be that 500,000, be that 2 million, whatever the case may be, again, these numbers move over time, is worth a lot more than having to pay, if you then have to pay them once they're a free agent, 80 million per year, 100 million per year, 6 million per year, whatever the case is, the differential between locking them in at that league minimum versus having to pay them in free agency is huge. That difference was never going to exist in Overwatch League because we set the Overwatch League minimum to 50K, and later it went up to, I want to say like 54, 55, 56, something in that range. But we set that here, and guess what? If you're playing AAA and you're playing it in a way where you can at all sustain yourself, you've got to be making at least like 20 to 30K off of it. Like, you got to, or you're just digging into your own savings. But if you're playing for an org, you're playing for an academy team, you've got to be making something looking something like this for it to just work. And the difference of, oh, well, we're going to have to pay you 50K in the league versus our top players, maybe we're going to pay 200K. And the difference is, well, 1 in 20 of you that we pay this much will be able to then get for this much instead of for this much is not nearly as attractive as, hey, we paid you this much in AAA and we get to now pay you, let's say 500K instead of 8 million a year. Well, that makes sense to take a chance and 1 in 20 pays off and you're paying them 500K per year instead of 8 million. That makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make sense when the differences are smaller like this in Overwatch League. You'd rather just go, hey, we're going to have to pay 200K more often, but we're not going to have to support these players that generally don't work out like this. Like, the model only made sense if players were actually making significantly more, and no one actually thought that through. So, little bit of a problem. The academy model. And the contenders idea was like, contenders exist for academy teams. Let's not kid ourselves.
Also reportedly months late on payment for the contender players.
This is standard. This is not some, oh, Blizzard is terrible thing. I don't know how many of you have been in the real world before, but if you are a little company working with a big company, they're going to insist on net 30, net 60, net 90 payment terms where they're able to pay you after they've received services that, you can invoice them and they'll pay you 30 days later, 60 days later, 90 days later. When you get as big as them, you can insist on better payment conditions that'll be closer to this, or will be, no, you're going to pay us before we deliver. But when you're like a small business working with a big business, and what is a player? A player is a pretty small business working with Activision Blizzard, a pretty large business. They're going to get bad terms. And the reason that happens is, again, the longer you can hold on to money, the more it can do for you in terms of earn interest, in terms of do all sorts of things. Like, the later that you can pay someone the same thing, if you don't have to then pay them more, having paid it later, the better for you. If I can borrow money from people at 0% interest, that's almost always a good deal as long as there's, as long as it's at 0% interest borrowing money, it's almost always a good deal because you expect growth. Now, there's some assumptions there of, growth will always happen, but like, if there's not I'm borrowing it for 2 days and then I have to pay it back, you would be happy from an investment standpoint to go, we'll take as much free interest money as we can get because, hey, we'll do that. And that's what these terms do. So, this is not some Blizzard Activision being terrible. It's not cool that companies do this, but companies do this. Like, Blizzard does this. Who else probably does this? I mean, we talked about HP Toyota. I bet they do that when they're working with small companies as well. Since those were some of the sponsors, we'll use them as examples.
Some receiving only some of their money, or none at all. This likely contributed to the biggest broadcaster of Overwatch contenders dropping altogether shortly after.
They weren't that big a player. They also weren't really making enough money to do it. It wasn't the timing of the payment.
The amateur scene suffering wasn't a good sign of things to come in Overwatch esports, because that's the lifeblood and the future of the game's talent pool.
It really doesn't matter. I hate to break this to people. Like, I want it to matter. I want it to be like, hey, a good path to pro matters. A good path to pro is important. As long as you can sell people on the idea that this is the best Overwatch out there, it doesn't actually matter if you're pulling from tier 2, a good, healthy, vibrant tier 2 scene, or if you're pulling from, hey, this guy's 4,600 SR on ladder. He's probably pretty good. Let's throw him into Overwatch League. As long as the audience believes that this is the best Overwatch out there, it's honestly fine from a, like, not from a, the integrity, the goodness, the total how good is Overwatch League, like the level of play. Yes, a stronger tier 2 scene leads to a stronger Overwatch League scene, but for the success of an esport, remember, most people can't actually tell. Can I tell? Sure, but, you know, like, most people really can't tell the difference between, did we have a really healthy tier 2 scene that led us to Overwatch League, or did we just pull some of the top ladder players that got high SRs and like, well, now this is the best in the world, and especially because you don't really test it. And we're very careful, mostly, to not let tier 2 test itself against Overwatch League, by the way, because Overwatch League does not want there to ever be a belief that, hey, Overwatch League isn't the top Overwatch being played in the world. And actually, right now, Overwatch League is the best Overwatch being played in the world, but there's been times when it hasn't been, and you very much need to keep the illusion that it is, and that is part of why they were so against third-party tournaments, and why they make such a big deal out of OWL players not being able to play in third-party tournaments and such. Because they don't necessarily want San Francisco Shock to go play in a team and lose to a tier 3 team. That would be terrible. Now, that one wouldn't happen, but you get it.
It's
because it calls the whole league into question.
Never a good sign in any competitive endeavor. Overwatch's in-game spending, aka a fancy way to not say loot box, would top an impressive $1 billion by July of 2019. Overwatch had no signs of going anywhere anytime soon, raking in great successes for their corporate overlords. Well, until the cracks started to form bit by bit. Combination of new heroes, balance issues would start to hurt Overwatch and its scene overall.
Okay.
By summer of 2019, Blizzard...
So I'm not convinced we've covered any of the real issues yet. And we're 28 minutes into our 41-minute video. So, no, that's not true. Toxicity, and specifically from it, and sort of a bigger one, would be the game was designed for team play. And this is number one, and this is the important one, and he has covered this. So I actually think it's fair. He has covered one of the single biggest issues, and then he's covered a secondary issue that's related to it. And then he's been like, esports struggling, which is sort of there. It's not nothing. I don't think we've actually covered any of the importance of why the esport has struggled yet, though, so I'm not willing to give it to him yet.
Had launched 6 different heroes, but 5.
Because again, the people not understanding how the contender scene is going to work isn't actually why the scene struggled.
5 in particular were problematic. For starters, Moira, the support character who required little to no aiming, was added, and to me, she lowered the overall skill floor for playing a support.
I mean, did she? Because, like, that Zen just was terrible. That's kind of on Zen, not Moira.
Whether that's bad or good, I think is actually more opinion-based. Bridget, or Brigette, or however you pronounce her name, nobody ever figured...
Moira signaled a poor design decision, but by herself wasn't actually that dangerous. Brig was catastrophic, as we know.
Was added after, and she would cause many nightmares before being finally nerfed much later. Bridget was basically a tank support who could assassinate enemy assassins.
Yeah, she was supposed to be a tank support. She ended up being a tank support DPS, which is just like, well, okay, this is ridiculous.
Due to her kit, which allowed her to basically stun you and then whack you a bunch of times until you died. Sigma was also added, and while not necessarily as outright annoying as Bridget,
just call her Brig.
Whatever her name is.
You know, you're in the Brig, you're in jail, Brig. I know most people go with Briggs, but like Brig jail, the Brig, it works.
Sigma yet again increased the shield prevalence, further shifting the meta towards more of a shield meta.
That's a really small amount. Like, I really hope we're not actually skipping over this, because if we're just going like releasing Moira was bad, releasing Brig was a little bit worse, releasing Sigma then led to Double Shield, like Goats deserves a much bigger portion than we're getting here. Double Shield happened and it was not a good meta to land after Goats, and it lasted too long considering how long Goats lasted, but like we really need to talk about Goats and how long it lasted.
Now you have another placeable shield that you can stack. The three of these
Especially because we like talked so much about Orisa earlier, and like
characters in unison though slowed down the speed of Overwatch as a game and made the game feel like it shifted it more into a MOBA category than the shooter category. Especially
it was actually always pretty heavily in the MOBA category. People just didn't realize it. Truth be told, they just weren't good enough at it yet.
with most hit scan and projectile based characters.
And a lot of that has to do with the coaching wasn't very good yet. And part of why the coaching wasn't very good yet is because the esport was so young that the players were like, oh, we need good players to be coaches. And no, they actually needed more good coaches from other scenes to come over and do coaching.
Made rather obsolete by these new heroes.
And other scenes can include other esports, but it can also include the real world. But those coaches need to also not just be like, it's all mentals, because some of them did. Some came over and were like, oh, it's the mentals. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. And it's like, no, it's not all mentals. Don't get me wrong. Mentals are really important. And I think coaches have a tendency to underestimate them when they've come up in the Overwatch world. But the initial wave of coaches that showed up were either, hey, you're really just our VOD bot, or hey, you used to be a good player, but like, you know, you've already fallen off and you're not good anymore and you don't really have any particular talent at coaching. Or they were the what did I say? Came over from another game and focused too hard on mentals, was just a VOD bot, that sort of thing. I mean, those were really the two, or teams weren't coached, or, you know, they had no respect for their coach, that sort of thing, because, well, they're, you know, not good at Overwatch, whatever the case may be. So I look at this one and go, yeah, the issue with why people were like, Overwatch is so hard in FPS, and then went, oh, later it's a MOBA, is because the understanding got better, and a lot of that has to do with coaching.
Heroes. They created a new meta altogether dubbed Goats, which was basically
we're talking
3 healers, 3 tanks, and was dominating the scene. This is where Blizzard's approach to hero design, I think, never had much place in competitive play. Similar story with Heroes of the Storm. Basically, these characters are set from the beginning to be designed to be fun and over the top to attract casual players.
Okay. I mean, yeah, the design philosophy is if everyone is overpowered, maybe everyone is balanced.
This requires creating very gimmicky and silly characters that sort of call into question competitive integrity. And when pressed about balance issues due to this,
I mean, I don't really think it was the issue, though. Like, I think we needed to foresee I think there's ways to do the everyone is overpowered, but you need to lean people pretty hard into their niche and not have them be too generalist. Brig is way too generalist if you're doing the balance through everyone being overpowered thing.
They have a very laissez-faire approach to feedback, letting the issues kind of persist for some time. To put kind of bluntly, the annoying part about Overwatch hero design is that it's annoying to get killed by certain heroes. When you can suddenly press a button and your team doesn't die until a field runs out, like Baptiste does, is it more of an ability-based game or a shooter? When heroes keep getting released that don't...
The game had defense matrix in it since very, very early. The game had speed boost in it since very, very early. You're trying to eliminate a Winston, but he leaps away and he doesn't get eliminated. Grr, that feels bad. You're trying to shoot a Lucio, but he doesn't get eliminated because he's wall riding. Grr, that feels bad. Like, it's always been a heavy ability game. It has gotten even more heavy ability based with the ability creep that we've seen since Ana, where instead of heroes having 2 abilities, they started to have 3 or 4 abilities, and abilities that started doing multiple things at once, like Sombra can hack players, which shows whether they have ult or not, takes away their ability to do abilities, can also be used in a different way to take health packs away from the enemies and make them regenerate fast, or Ana's Nade, which does 4 different things. It does damage, it heals, it increases healing received, it stops the opponents from receiving heals. Like, we started doing ability creep in that sense, I agree, but Overwatch always has had things that have been like, hey, it's annoying that you're shooting at this thing and it doesn't get eliminated. You're shooting at a Reinhardt, he's down to 50 health, and he puts his shield up and he doesn't get eliminated. Yeah, that's the point. The game was always a mix.
Don't require much aiming or shooting, and have very powerful abilities. Well, you can kind of see my point.
Right, but Reinhardt and Winston were always in the game, and their aim requirements are not that high.
Overwatch at launch and in
to get most of the way up with them. Yes, they do have aim and mechanic requirements.
Beta felt more like a hybrid of the two. Overwatch by the end of 2019 felt more squarely like an ability-based
Yeah, in GOATS it did feel more like an ability-based game, sure.
hero game, and that kind of seemed to contradict their constant push to esports and the competitive crowd.
I mean, pretending that we can't have an ability-based esport is a little disingenuous.
In a shocking turn of events, mainly because Blizzard typically takes ages to release sequels, Overwatch 2 would be announced November 2019. Overwatch
November 2019. Ouch. Ouch.
2 was set to fill the missing PvE component of Overwatch that Overwatch was only ever to flirt with in events. Overwatch 2 would also be affecting the PvP gameplay, including the PvP balancing, hero reworks, and the removal of the 6th hero, making the game now
Well, that was a way later announcement. We're kind of skipping the timeline there, but okay.
now 5 versus 5. Overwatch 1 and 2 players will share the PvP experience effectively. On top of this, they would be nerfing some healing and shields as well as introducing a new game type dubbed Push. The idea is that the shift would move Overwatch to more of an exciting playstyle game, having one less tank. While this might help things, I'm not convinced it's the deciding factor ultimately, but we shall see. Well, if the sequel does
We'll see.
indeed launch, with Blizzard being unable to commit to a launch even as late as 2023. The biggest dagger
I mean, they just won't announce. We'll get it by 2023. Like, sometime in 2023 it'll release, if it doesn't release at the very end of
that would
this.
come out from the Overwatch 2 news was the effective discontinuing of new heroes and significant content for Overwatch 1.
And that was really the death blow right there. I still think we didn't put nearly enough emphasis on GOATs. We didn't put nearly enough emphasis on the fact that after GOATs, which lasted a huge amount of time and wasn't fun to watch and wasn't terribly fun for ladder to play. But also, again, if you're looking at the top and they're all playing GOATs and you're like, well, we're not going to play GOATs. Well, now you don't get that, like, oh, I'm going to emulate that. I'm going to study it. So that hurts a little bit. Then you went into Double Shield, which was, not a good meta to immediately follow it. Like, those were bad. And then you didn't actually in Overwatch League go into your location-based gameplay that was supposed to be the justification for the big spend in, was supposed to actually make sense from, like, we can actually get people in their 20s and 30s coming out to stadiums, getting to have fun with other people their age, talking about video games at an in-person event like they would with live music. Like, there was a secret formula there, and we really haven't put the emphasis on those things that needed to be put. Like, those were big factors, those things. And instead, we briefly covered that GOATs happened. We briefly covered that, hey, shields people didn't particularly like. And then we said, oh, shield breaking is important, which hurts me. But instead, we put a ton of emphasis on something that is hugely correct in the form of, hey, this game was designed to be about team play, wasn't supposed to be released with a solo queue, but then ultimately got a solo queue. Like, that emphasis was right, and a secondary emphasis on Toxicity was okay, but I think we've missed some big factors in the downfall of Overwatch over time, because those things were true even from almost the beginning of Overwatch. This Toxicity thing and this bigger picture, hey, this was designed to be a team game, but people are playing it solo queue, and that's frustrating. And, some of that frustration just builds up over time, but those things are not the reason we went from, hey, there's 30 million players to whatever we have now.
1, effectively putting the game in some sort of maintenance.
Those had a lot more to do with, yes, this maintenance mode that had some of it, though we'd lost a lot by then already, not nearly as much as we'd lost since. Well, that's sort of true. We had probably lost as much before, but a lot of that was the video game tourism that you're always going to have and you just can't avoid. The things that are, really need to be focused heavily on here is you can't have boring, stale, bad metas. You can have stale metas, but you can't have boring, stale, bad metas, because to most people, that's what GOATS was. From a coaching perspective, it was fine. From a professional play perspective, GOATS was actually mostly fine. Yes, we can talk about that one to the end of the world. Some DPS players didn't like it. That's mostly because they couldn't get scouted, not because they didn't enjoy playing it with their teams. Those were, things that actually caused continued decline up until this
mode. As long as Overwatch 2 remains unlaunched,
we got live music though. Remember DJ Khaled? The wrong DJ? Yeah.
Overwatch 1 is stuck in a bit of a purgatory, limbo, whatever you want to call it. Sequel announcement in an unsure future, and no new updates for Overwatch 1 isn't good for the game's longevity, and nothing short of dying. Overwatch and subsequently Overwatch League were in trouble by January of 2020. For starters, most of the PvE and holiday events up to this point had just been recycled, which is not very AAA company-like to not constantly be creating new, novel content, especially with Fortnite out there.
I mean, by then, yes. The thing is, before then, it kind of was. Like, every holiday, let's have a new event. No, that wasn't necessarily the standard before. Blizzard sort of lost to the fact that it did, hey, we're not going to charge you more for this game after release, when other games have been, no, we're going a completely different monetization model, but those games all came out after it. Like, that's not totally fair to how Blizzard, the infrastructure or the landscape that Blizzard actually released their game into originally. Most of the games that we see topping Blizzard right now, if we look at, playing, Twitch viewership, etc., some of them are old school things like Grand Theft Auto, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are going to be games and, older school stuff like League, but League did have that sort of model. But, we look at the Fortnites, the Valorants, the Apexes, those came out after the PUBGs when it was popular and, got to come out using Blizzard's success as, okay, we can take this a step further.
Overwatch had become stale, and the aforementioned issues had led to a bleed in the population. But the Overwatch League was...
Yeah, this series gets views, James. This series gets views. It's a little surprising that this guy doesn't actually have a little bit of a bigger subscriber base, but I think it's because most of what gets watched from him, and I don't know that, is this series, which, you can't do this series all the time.
Facing far harsher problems, with 3 big broadcasting talents in similar Monte Cristo and DOA dropping out, and
I'm not sure Doa was a big loss there.
complaints overall of just low viewership. Nate Manzer, the original OWL lead, had left the company, which according to Monte Cristo, led to irreconcilable creative and philosophical differences.
Sure, but let's not pitch that as a bad thing. Like, him leaving might have sort of been bad, but he got to leave because he got an offer elsewhere because he was running the league successfully. Like, oh no, our talent got poached. That's like me going like, okay, I've got a contenders team here. We did whatever we did. Maybe we got second place. Maybe we got third place. And our players got poached. 2 of our players got poached to OWL, or 2 of our players got poached to the top team or whatever. Like, that's fine. That shows that your team is doing what it's supposed to do, and it's actually easier for you to go recruit for the future. You might be slightly worse, but your brand starts looking better, and it's easier for you to recruit from the future because you've shown success. The next rung on the ladder is pulling you up. So, that wasn't bad. Now, it may have led to bad things, and that the person who took his place, Monty, didn't get along with, and maybe that was the end of the world. Monty was a reasonably good talent from a different place that probably helped to bring in some viewership. So, I agree that probably was a loss, and Monty also believed and maybe did have some understanding of how to make esports successful, and he liked being able to whisper in the ear of important people. But unfortunately, that happens at companies. If you stay at a company long enough, people move on. They bounce after 2-3 years. They bounce after they're successful. They bounce after 6-7 years, whatever. And you might have been well networked in the past, and if you didn't climb yourself into top management positions or keep building out a further and more expansive network, you find yourself with less influence. That is how it works. And it sounds like Monty was too closely tied to, he wants to have design, not decision-making power, but he wants to have some influence. He wants to feel like he's heard, and he didn't properly build out a network with enough people outside of Nate or something. And that sucks for Monty, but probably a learning experience.
Between myself and the league's current leadership. Many reasons for these issues outside of the game's issues and the issues of the viewership, though. The pro and talent involved in the OWL League were reportedly having to travel around 76,000 miles, which is nearly double an NBA player's travel time.
Sure, because we tried to make this a worldwide league instead of a North American league. Yeah, traveling North America is, or the U.S. effectively, because we're talking the U.S. and Canada really. So, but North America is a big continent, but it's not the world that we're talking about. So of course there's going to be more travel time. But again, these players and teams needed to adjust their training expectations, but none of them were willing to do it. They're all like, we've got to continue training super hard. How will we ever take breaks? And I remember all the fans going like, yeah, how will they ever take breaks? That's too much play for them. And it's like, they should practice less. You don't see baseball teams doing a ton of practice games in the middle of the season, and they play lots and lots of games per season. They have a long season. If they go for, 3 or 4 days without a game. They might do a practice game. They might do a simulated game. But most of the time, their practice is going to be like, hey, we'll do some warm-up type stuff before the game. We'll do, some batting practice before the game, but not a ton. And that's how it's gotta work. Remember, these guys have already trained a lot to get through tier 2, to get to the top of the ladder, that sort of thing. It didn't have to be this, I'm super prepped for the opposing team. I'm ranting, I know.
Throw in the fact that you're playing on a computer, and yeah, it gets kind of weirder, right? Al being a failure isn't a surprise to most who have been in esports for a long time. It's just more frustrating that the failure was so predicted by so many people. Because that's an awful lot of money to be artificially throwing into a scene only to pull it right back out. That doesn't really create an ecosystem. At least not a stable one. Blizzard again has done this twice, and if they aren't a lesson to other developers to not try and force an esport on a game, especially with boatloads of money, I don't know who would be.
Hearthstone was a pretty rough pullout, but it wasn't doing terribly well. Overwatch didn't really have the serious pullout that Hearthstone had.
Blizzard was still somehow able to keep scoring these deals though, as another $160 million deal would come from YouTube, though
Sure.
That would be bundled with the Call of Duty League. Overwatch was meanwhile suffering from more design issues regarding heroes and matchmaking. For starters, in order to enforce the 2-2-2 meta, Blizzard would implement a role queue that would lock you to your preferred role.
We are way out of order on our timeline, but okay.
The problem with the role queue was, well, it highlighted more of the game's problems in the first place. There were double the amount of offense characters compared to the tank or the support characters. So people wanting to play DPS more wasn't just because of support and tank are boring, it was because statistics, right?
No, it was not because of statistics. It was not. Doubling the number of tank heroes is not going to double the number of people that are willing to play tank. Yes, it will increase the number of people that are willing to play tank, but doubling the number of tank heroes is not, I repeat, not going to double the amount of people that are willing to play tank. That's not how it works. DPS heroes are more appealing to more people at large. That's how it works. That is how it works, and releasing more tanks is not vastly going to fix that.
Right? If anything, it made it worse, funneling everyone into only one role and then giving you really long queue times. Kaplan stated it wasn't an attempt to try to fix the GOATS meta or the esports meta
Of course it was.
either, which sorry, I just don't buy. But by May of 2020, they were adding an open queue mode that doesn't require a role lock back to the game. That's basically admitting at this point that they didn't really know what to do, so might as well just go back on what they had said. It seemed like the more Blizzard tried to restrict and constrain their meta and control it in their player base, the more negatively they were reacting. And maybe that's because they were doing it after the fact, or just kind of messing up. 2020 would only
Yeah, they've lost their vision. I mean, at this point in the game's life cycle, they've lost their vision. This is what I was talking about much earlier in this stream, where we're looking at a situation where the best balance, not actually in this case, but in many games, one of your strongest balance points is when you still have the vision and the developers still understand what they want their game to be. That sort of first major balance after the game has been released. And we're pretty far from that at this point in their life cycle, and that's why we have open queue and role queue. Like, both of those are things, so sure.
only see a single hero introduced, down from the previous 2 and 3 a year Blizzard was maintaining previously, which even then is pretty damn snail pace compared to League or even Heroes of the Storm. By 2020,
Our graphics are a lot better than League's. A lot. Our characters have banter with each other in Overwatch. Our characters have animations that actually differ from character to character, unlike other games. Like, it's not totally fair to compare to what those other games are. There's, like, a lot more that you have to release for these heroes, or that goes into releasing a hero in this game compared to some of its competitors in that sense. But it's a fair point.
just 4 years after launch, players were already starved for content.
Okay, what do we got?
March 2021, and Blizzard would suffer from a 50-person layoff relating to esports and a shift away from in-person events to online.
That's not a lot of people, and that 50-person layoff, like, it's basically, hey, we closed down our arena.
Online primarily due to the pandemic. They no longer would need the extra 50 people, I assume, to run the online events, or a convenient way to let go of a bloated esports branch. We don't know exactly.
It's literally, we're closing our arena. But
I was certainly in trouble, though, with last year's grand finals having a 61% decline in viewership from the previous year.
Yep.
OW abandoning in-person events wasn't going to cut it either. After all, they designed their esports as a franchised-based esport.
Okay, so we are talking about this. Our order is just
Without
wrong.
local events to fund the franchise teams, they weren't going to be making the revenue they needed to really even break.
That is one of the things, the franchise teams, and part of why they shut down the open team, not the open team, why they shut down the third-party tournaments is because one of the things that was supposed to provide value to the Overwatch League teams was they were supposed to have basically exclusive rights to host 5 events per year. So they could like host their own tournaments and things like that, and they could charge viewership for them, they could charge to compete in them, whatever, but that would be a thing that they could do as another way to make money, and basically no one took them up on that. There were some things that got taken up on, the Battle for California, things like that, but basically those never came to fruition.
Break even. Viewership numbers most likely were only going to continue to decrease. And at that point, you're paying millions of dollars for a slot that doesn't make you much money. Throughout this time,
Well, no, you're not continuing to pay millions of dollars. I mean, if you had a payment plan, you're continuing to pay millions of dollars, but you already committed the money. And again, you guys got back a lot of money on that Amazon deal and then some money on that YouTube deal. So, like, let's not pretend that. You're still spending money on having staff, having players, having, a media team, having a social media team, whatever. You're still spending money on that, but let's not pretend that like, oh, I'm continuing to spend millions on that. That's yesterday's money. And yeah, in hindsight, you wouldn't have spent it, but you did.
Activision Blizzard was involved in a
There is no option to be like, oh, well, I'm going to stop paying this now. No, that's not how it works.
court case regarding rampant toxic harassment behaviors in the company,
Yeah,
and this
sure.
made them fairly negative in the public perception,
It's a
causing
clue,
them to
it's a
potentially
clue.
lose State Farm, T-Mobile, and Coca-Cola as sponsors.
We've been over that. We partially debunked that. That got reported before it was true, which potentially put pressure on the companies to make it true, which is scummy, but sometimes that's how activist journalism works.
To make matters worse, a Hong Kong esports player of Hearthstone, known as Blitzchung, would don a mask and
That is completely the wrong timeline of things. Like, this event is believed to be part of what prompted our Overwatch 2 release, which was talked about back here. Like, no. The Overwatch 2 release the Overwatch 2 announcement coming so early is believed to have been in part due to this. Like, why are we talking about this now?
asked people during a live interview to liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times. These protests would be related to the 2019 through 2020 Hong Kong protests. While I'm not going to dedicate much time to the giant struggle between Hong Kong and mainland China, and how China is basically trying to pretend that Hong Kong doesn't exist, and of course
Sure.
the people of Hong Kong are being harassed, silenced, and even worse, in some cases death.
What do we got?
But how the controversy affected Blizzard was after the interview, it was immediately pulled off air. How Blizzard responded to the whole thing made people feel
the
even
response
worse.
was rough.
Shortly after the stream was cut, and Blizzard would ban Blitzchung. Blizzard had shown with the action
They
that
also
they were
got rid
willing
of
to
the
put
casters.
Chinese interests over the interests
And the casters actually got the tougher hit than Blitzchung did, because Blitzchung, of course, was able to go get a lot of donations, money, etc., which is fine. I mean, that makes sense. And then pivot himself into a new and probably more profitable, because Hearthstone's on the decline, area. The casters, on the other hand, had a bit of a rougher time.
of the people of Hong Kong, or even Blizzard's own audience. Would have been a perfect moment for the group of heroes meant to save the world to kind of do some saving, huh? Blizzard's last play is the transition to Overwatch 2. Something that they hope to show off in April of 2022 by allowing the OWL players to play on an early build of the game. But Overwatch 2 wasn't different or deep enough for many players to warrant being called a true sequel.
Okay, we haven't seen the PvE yet, we haven't seen the new heroes yet, and what we did get to see included a lot of Overwatch 1 heroes being disabled, to be fair.
More of a content update asking for a price tag, and it has not launched for 2 years after being announced,
Yeah.
so the hype is kind of running cold.
True.
The future of Overwatch is all but done with the transition on the horizon, as we already have discussed. But we're discussing more than just the failure of Overwatch 1 now.
And then we got
If
our latest
Overwatch
patch,
2 doesn't knock
which,
things out of the park,
Hanzo
there's
needed
a good
buffs.
chance that both Overwatches
Clearly.
could be in danger for a maintenance mode, just like Heroes of the Storm, or worse, total abandonment like Warcraft 3 Reforged.
Oh, yeah.
Blizzard would lose many of its most talented developers throughout this drama, the court case drama, and subsequent dramas, including the main driving force behind Overwatch itself, Jeff Kaplan.
So many reasons to become jaded and cynical in the world in general right now. There are. There's a reason that institutional trust in general is the lowest it's ever really been.
Kaplan would not only just leave Overwatch, but Blizzard altogether, and we can only speculate as to why. But with Activision Blizzard having so many stories leaked about them at this point, I think we have a bit of an idea. Without Kaplan to helm Overwatch 2, that doesn't necessarily mean it's guaranteed to fail or anything, but it
No,
doesn't
it could
spell
work.
well for the game's future. They
That's a
lost
fair take.
arguably the most important developer behind the project, the one who kind of stuck out and kept the project alive. It feels like the passion left with Kaplan. Not that passion was enough to keep the franchise going without significant change, but it makes the current Overwatch experience, I think, just feel that much more hollow. Especially when, like I talked about with the Blitzchung situation and sexual harassment situations, when the premise of the entire game is built on heroes from all over the world, Mexico, the US, France, Russia, Korea, all uniting together to defeat evil. Meanwhile, the evil in this case is now the company behind the game itself.
A little bit of a reach, but okay.
Well, Overwatch is literally the name given to these groups of heroes. But how are we supposed to feel motivated to play as them for a company who cares so little for its workers and their health?
Okay. Are you done?
It's that time of the video, detectives, the point where we compile all of the clues
Okay,
and evidence
so
gathered
you
up
do
until
a
this point
Final
for a
conclusion,
deduction
right, to figure out what led there. So let's see how he does,
to
guys.
put
Let's
this case
score
to
him.
bed regarding the death of
Again, if I were to go through my score here, I think what is important is the team queue effectively not happening, but being designed for team queue. Whatever, we can go like that. I think he'll go on the toxicity, which is a much smaller point. I want to put that later. I'll give it to him, though. So he's going to hit that. And how it wasn't dealt with. He, I hope, is going to make a much bigger deal out of goats and the length of it. I hope we then talk about how double shield immediately after it, and he could combine these with a stale meta type thing, but I think these need to be talked about. And more so than he did. I hope they at least make his final points here. These are important. Team Q, Toxicity, Goats, Double Shield, / slow meta shifts in general when things weren't like that. And then I think Overwatch 2 early announcement. And this will be Overwatch 2 early announcement, and then, you know, support totally pulled. I'd say these are the 5. Of these, I would actually say this is the least important. This needs to be up-ranked slightly. This needs to be up-ranked significantly. These are what I would expect to see, and I think it's a reasonable conclusion. And I actually think he hit most of these, so I think it's a reasonable video. I just think that this has been massively underplayed. And, you know, this as it attaches to it, because it's an attached point, needs to be in there pretty well as well. I think we'll instead hear about, not instead, but I think we're probably going to get too much emphasis on the Hong Kong thing, and we're also going to get too much emphasis on Blizzard getting sued and not the company that's great, and how that differs from Overwatch based on what we saw at the end there. And I really don't think those are terribly large factors, other than the, you know, Hong Kong thing led to this, which is bad. He juxtaposes Overwatch with TF2, which quietly keeps on chugging along. Never mind that Overwatch player numbers still dwarf TF2 and is still a live esports league about to enter its 5th season. Yeah, you know, I wouldn't call TF2 completely destroyed. TF2 can do a little bit better in some areas than Overwatch. But yeah, Overwatch League is still alive. Oh, never mind. I missed a huge point here. And this actually will need to be up-ranked, which is going to be Owl not local. Owl wasn't actually made local, and this is a huge point that needs to be upvoted here. So these are the 6 I expect to see, or I would hope to see. I think we're probably going to overrate Toxicity, which is going to make me unhappy. I think we're going to talk about the Hong Kong thing / Blizzard lawsuits effectively. I think we're going to talk too much about these things, and that is going to be like, those aren't really what did it. But we'll see.
the game, Overwatch. Issues with
Love it! Some Detective Conan. I love that.
balance, hero balance, and
Yeah, full weeb coming out there.
etc. Conflict design and game focus, like a casual game pushing for esports.
No, this was not an issue whatsoever.
A boring and complicated game mode with poor tutorials.
I'll give you poor tutorials. I think this is a watchability issue, so I'm gonna give maybe a half cross out here. The tutorials are an issue. The watchability is an issue. The game modes being like Cart or King of the Hill, they're fine.
Artificially pushed and failed as an esport.
Nope, not the problem. The problem with this was the local leagues didn't happen. Or not the local leagues, the local play, the like what thing that was supposed to make it all hold together didn't happen.
Poor content offering and an update schedule for a blockbuster title.
Yeah, I agree with this. The poor content isn't really it, but the upgraded schedule, I'm going to agree with that. This, you really should be more points than it is because it's huge. Goats, how long it lasted, and you can tie that back to update schedule if you want, and again, double shield. So, sure, I'm good with that.
Issues with toxicity due to...
I knew you were going to put that here. It's like, it's a little bit true.
built-in design, and lack of management by Blizzard. Bad publicity and total loss of faith of their audience.
Okay, I'm gonna downrank it a little bit, but yeah, it happened.
Announced a sequel, delayed it, then
Yeah, this is real. I'm good with this.
put the game in a limbo.
Okay.
Announced a sequel.
So, I mean, I give him points for case closed music. Like, who doesn't want to see some Conan Edogawa solve the crime? I expect to see Richard Moore put to sleep with the stun gun wristwatch there. And, hey, fun times. But if we're looking at this more seriously, I actually think in the video he did touch on enough of the issues and that it's fine. I just think his sort of post wrap-up here and what he's focusing on in conclusion, he's gathered the clues and he didn't really weigh the clues properly here. So, you know, maybe he found the wrong suspect and is sending the wrong person to trial and they'll get off. Maybe.
Sequel, delayed it, then put the game in a limbo.
What do we got?
Overwatch's failure strikes home for me, as I personally invested a lot of time into the game.
Yeah, you tried to go pro at it. I can totally get why. I coached it professionally. I don't like some of the failure stuff we're seeing either.
But it stands out to me, because here you still have Team Fortress 2 chugging along quietly. Meanwhile, Overwatch has this massive fall from grace. Part of me feels like with their approaches respectively,
I mean, it also had a higher peak. It was expected to be able to compete with League of Legends and such. TF2 was never expected to compete with League of Legends, never believed of like, oh, you should be able to take on Valorant, Apex, that sort of thing. TF2 is a fine game and is still very much alive, but a game that has some more players and an esport league by definition is also alive? Sure.
it was inevitable for the result to happen the way it did, even though they both shared very giant success to start. But I do really feel that Overwatch is one of the highest profile examples of developers just fumbling the bag that we have featured on the series so far.
That you featured on the series. I mean, there's been big high-profile fumbles. I mean, Cyberpunk 76, huge fumble.
They really had the dream. A massive audience willing to buy loot boxes and make them billions.
Sure.
One who was even satisfied with less content being offered. But not the litany of issues that came with being an Overwatch player. Ultimately, Activision
Fair.
Blizzard simply aren't the same company anymore, and can't rely on the goodwill of the previous regime, and
Dude, you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised how long people will still go for the nostalgia, just buy their game, even after Warcraft 3 Reforged, even after Diablo 3's initial terrible release, even after Overwatch got left in limbo. Some people are going to wise up and be like, hey, not so much, they're not day zero buys of games anymore, but I think you're going to be surprised by how many people will still do the day zero buys, because you still see it with Square Enix. Square Enix, you know, Final Fantasy XIV is good, but Final Fantasy XIV initially was terrible. We haven't really had a great Final Fantasy game since, I'd say, you know, with good plot, everything, etc., since the era of, you know, 10. That was 20 years ago at this point. 9 was okay, 8 was okay, 7 was obviously great, that sort of thing. So, like, 14 became good, but it's a very different type of game than the normal game. Final Fantasy 13 wasn't terribly good. Final Fantasy 14 took a re-release before it became good. Final Fantasy 15 was a pretty meh, average, whatever game. It certainly doesn't live up to the title of Final Fantasy that we've come to associate with some of their previous games in that 6, 7, 10, 4 era. So, like, yeah. But still a ton of people went and bought Final Fantasy 15. So, like, I think you're going to see the same thing continue with Blizzard here.
IPs to save them anymore. And I doubt many are so willing to give them another shot, frankly. But I wish Overwatch 2 the best of success, because I never wish any game or company to fail.
Sure.
But if Overwatch 2 fails as well, then I guess you guys know where to find me, detectives. Thanks for watching, guys.
Okay, so that's the end of his video. Zergling says, watching a little bit late, but I never thought the game needed to get a dedicated team queue. It just needed to try not to compensate for the assumed advantage the stack gave you. Just base it off of MMR like solo queue. No, it did. It did need a queue, and I don't think you're in real time, Zergling. I think I'm seeing your comment, and you're watching earlier, so I'm not going to have a conversation with you about it because you can't hear me to have the conversation. But you look at that, and the team you really would have helped, it would have let it be that cult classic. Synergies are just so powerful in this game, but also the way that people have such different understandings of how you're supposed to win the game. Like, this guy, for example, thinks you're supposed to break the shields. That's what you're supposed to do. Whereas I would be like, no, dive past the shield. No, take angles to shoot around the shield. And you guys have seen similar things where your teams might go, they insist in gold that you need Reinhardt, whereas, no, a player who is better, or is at least looking at better gameplay, trying to become better, might be going, no, in Masters, they're running Wrecking Ball. I'm going to go do this. And hey, why can't you do it? And hey, I'm going to go do this. Or a Winston might be going, I'm going to jump in and get my bubble and get healed by Anna, and it's going to work, and it doesn't, because that's not the reality of how it's going to work for them in their bronze game, or whatever the case may be. Like, that was always going to be really, really hard to not have people get upset over. But that's how the game is. And the game has to be balanced to some degree because of the fundamental ways the game was designed to go, hey, we have to work, you have to balance Winston in a way that he can get a Zarya bubble and Anna healing. But anyway, I've had this discussion. I think the real point here would be, the game was designed for synergies. The game was designed for team play. The game was not designed for, hey, one of the 3 members in your squad goes down and you can frag your way back in if you're 20% better than your opponents. The way that most games actually are designed. There's like fundamental design decisions that don't let you do that in Overwatch, which is fine for a team-based game, but doesn't work as well when you add ladder. Okay. You skipped ahead. There we go. Okay, Final Fantasy franchise is inherently absurd because they keep making sequels to the previous one, not final. I know, but it did make sense at the time. Final Fantasy was the release of, hey, we're doing this. Final Fantasy was their last chance. If it doesn't work, we're going bankrupt, or, we're going to fail. And it did, so then, of course, they were going to continue the series because it saved them. But the lore does make sense there. I'm convinced that it's completely impossible to balance this game unless you completely rework half the heroes. Lol. Balance it for what? Balance it for Overwatch 2? Balance it to be more like games that allow more individual carry potential? Balance it for, like, organized play? Because I'd say before this patch, and this patch shouldn't be the end of the world, before this patch, the game was in a pretty darn balanced state. Did you have some heroes that were a little better than others? Yeah, but, like, we don't want a perfectly balanced game. I know that's going to seem weird to some people, but if you have a perfectly balanced game, it's okay. You all have 200 HP, you all have the same weapon that fires at the same fire rate, that has the same amount of ammo, and when you press the left click button, it does 50 damage. Perfectly balanced game. Like, so you're going to have to accept some level of drift if it's not going to be perfectly balanced to allow for some level of diversity. That's how it works. And I think it was pretty reasonably balanced for about a year there. It was also pretty good on release, just after release, that sort of thing. I think through much of Dive, it was pretty well balanced. I think, the Mercy meta, not so much. That was a Dive meta, but it was a still very Dive meta in what got played, at least. Okay. Why should I, as a low plat, have to fight a top 500 team just because I am in a 6-stack? You're not fighting a top 500 team as in a 6-stack as a low plat, unless the rest of your team is significantly higher than plat. think the most balanced state of the game was when hero bans were a thing. Strong disagree on that one. I don't think hero bans are amazing for this game. They could be better in Overwatch 2. They could be a little bit better now that our cast has gotten bigger, but there's so much you can do with just a single hero ban in this game in terms of like, hey, we've taken away Lucio. You effectively can't play Brawl anymore. Oh, that's a big takeaway. That sort of thing. So like, not sure I love that one. In season 2, it happened multiple times. Oh, but you're playing in Australia. Got it. You're playing in Australia in a you have a different experience than me because you're playing in a region that has a smaller player base. Yes. In small player base regions, you do get a bit more of that. And I could agree that some level of they've done that too hard in terms of that. I think the game would be better if they didn't load up an expectation that you're going to hard synergize with your teammate. I can agree with that Zergling dance, but because most stacks wouldn't be. I think you'd get more stacking if that happened, and most stacks wouldn't be abusing synergies, and I don't mind it that a few are. So I actually agree with that part, Zergling dance, but I still don't think that changing that fixes the design issue of this was designed to be a team game and it's not going to feel satisfying in a single player mode, and that's going to create toxicity issues and things like that. Okay. This game has been incredibly balanced for not this current balance patch that just released that we're on, but the balance, like, for the last year before that, this game was incredibly balanced. I would also say this game was pretty darn balanced after its first major balance cycle. Before we started getting the, like, crazy mech diva that had 4 seconds of DM and 400 armor and things like that, before we had that, but in that first major cycle, where we might have had, like, a Cassidy, a Soldier Affair that were a little bit on the powerful side, but Winston's bubble might have been a little weak at the time, but overall that was a pretty darn balanced game as well. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and call it there. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you have, please drop a like, consider subscribing so you can see more content like this. If you would like to get coaching yourself, because I do provide coaching, former top contenders coach here, you can join my Discord in the description below to see what rates look like. You can also join my Discord if you want to see what I'm covering, because I do a fair amount of different types of content. I obviously react to videos like this one. I do coaching videos. I cover concepts. I sometimes review professional gameplay. I cover a lot of the Overwatch collegiate scene. Sometimes we find ourselves in other places, like talking about kill switches in cars, so just weird news stories or video game news. We're a bit all over the place. If you're like, hey, some of that might be interesting to me, some of it might not. Easiest way to figure out if it's going to be interesting is join that Discord, react to become a watcher, and then you can get pings and see if what I'm covering is interesting to you. But that's going to do it, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Thanks!